Welcome to a Zero Indent special, where today we're doing something unusual and we're taking a deep dive into The Last of Us Remake and what it means for an impressionistic artwork to become more fully realized. My name is DC McNeil, author of the Maynard Trig series and editor-in-chief at Zero Indent. I'm joined by media writer and YouTuber Danielle from Level Story. How are you doing, Danielle?
Hi, good. How are you?
I'm very excited to talk about The Last of Us again for the millionth time. I feel like it's all we ever do.
I know.
This will be like...
It's a great game to talk about.
There's a lot to say, I feel. This will be like the 8th hour of audio we've recorded about it, I think. So...
oh my God.
Yeah, it's... we keep going back to it. And I keep writing about it. I've written a few articles about it recently. I just think, you had the issue of Level Story about The Last of Us. We talked a lot about it then. We talked a lot about it during our kind of deep dive into Last of Us Part 2. I just think as a franchise, it's attempting to be literature in a way that a lot of games don't attempt. And the way that it goes about that and the impact that has on what some people think text is, I think is really, really, really interesting. Because, I mean, we talked about this a lot with The Last of Us Part 2, but like this series kind of, it's like, kids first real story type thing where a lot of people played this and they were like, oh my God, it's so real, I can't believe it. And then if you've like read a book one time, you're like, oh, this isn't doing anything particularly new, but the medium it's in is very different and the maneuvers are very different. And so for that reason, it's super interesting. The reason that we're talking about it again is that they have released a 2022, so its official title is The Last of Us Part 1, and it is not to be confused with The Last of Us, which was on the PS3, and then The Last of Us Remake.
Originally 3.
Yeah, and then The Last of Us Remake, which was The Last of Us Remastered, which was PS4.
Right.
This is now The Last of Us Part 1, which is on the PS5. Because they will publish this, much like Skyrim. This will be on every PlayStation you've ever owned. And maybe it should be, I don't know. I have a lot of conflicting thoughts about it. But...
Look, it kind of already was. Like, PS5 has backwards compatibility, my friend. So,
That's true. Yeah. Actually, so sitting in my PlayStation games library is that old version of the game.
Yeah.
From when I first purchased it, yeah. Which is really interesting. I guess before we get into the kind of the meat and potatoes of it, so like we sort of usually do with these close readings, we'll work through the story in kind of chronological chunks. We'll talk about different things as they come up. I guess at a high level, so... I played this right before it first came out, worked through it, didn't really end up doing anything after the embargo lifted. I just kind of like finished it, wrote a few articles, and then kind of parked it. I know that you were keen to dig into it. You probably had a similar experience that I did where, I guess, talk me through your experience of coming back to it, and then sort of... What are your general thoughts or what are your general takeaways at a very high level? Where's your head at with it as a project that kind of, or as a piece of work that is now out in the world that is sort of this interesting project that Naughty Dog have kind of undertaken?
Yeah, so overall, my general thoughts after playing it is that I love it. I love this PS5 remake of the game. Being that this is a favorite game of mine, it enhances what I loved about the game originally. It doesn't do anything that new or different necessarily, but the things it does, I find kind of change the context of certain scenes and just enrich them, which in ways we'll talk about. I will say that I was not keen on playing it originally. As you know, when you originally reached out to me, I was sort of like, yeah, I'm not touching it. Like, it's expensive, and from what I've seen, it looks like the same game, just enhanced graphics, which I would argue it kind of is, but we'll get to that. But there's more to it than just that. So I didn't really want to play it for the price tag. I ended up getting a trial to Gamefly to play it because I was anxious to talk about it, and I was anxious to, I guess, just experience it and see what it was all about, to see if sort of the hype train was actually worth it. And I don't think it was worth $70, but I definitely think for people who love this game or love the remastered and the original version, this is definitely worth playing, and I loved my time with it immensely.
Yeah, I would probably echo that. I had a pretty similar experience where I wasn't dying to play it, and then the second the game opens and you're running down that street with Ellie in your arms, I was with what's his daughter's name?
Oh, Sarah.
Sarah. I was just immediately in. Like, I was back there for the same feelings that I had the first. Like, it just completely captures you. I played this one on a much harder difficulty this time, which I really enjoyed. And I did something that I don't normally consciously do in games, where I walked everywhere. So instead of using Joel's light jog, I just walked the whole time. And really was focused on sort of taking in the environment and the storytelling happening in the environment. And it kind of fundamentally changed, I guess, how I view this game in relation to the second game. So I played this through, and then I played the second game again straight afterwards. And that was kind of what ended up making me want to talk about it, I think. Because it's when they're on the same technology, right? Because I played The Last of Us Part 1 before The Last of Us Part 2 came out, then I played Part 2. But putting them side by side, sort of with the same, for want of a better word, the same era of technology, right? Like they're built on this modern stack and the modern graphics engines. Putting them side by side like that, it really drew the contrast of these two games, while they claim to be sequels to each other, thematically definitely are not in any meaningful way. And this was really where I felt that. And I think as you said, a lot of the context of this game changes because of some of the changes that they've made. And it fundamentally shifts the way that I understood this, or understood certain scenes, or the context of understanding certain scenes. I think this version brings out the acting a lot clearer. They get to do some really interesting maneuvers with some character remodeling that really, for me, completely changed how I viewed the story, full stop, which we'll talk about when we get to Boston QZ. But yeah, I had a similar experience. I love this. I played it with the full graphics, the performance mode set up. I had the big sound system. Like, I really had the whole full experience, and thoroughly enjoyed it. Okay, so nice. I'll set us up for the prologue, because I've got a little bit to talk about there. I think we'll probably have the most to talk about when we get to the QZ, and because that really sets up the rest of the story, I think. So the game begins in 2013 by introducing Joel, a single father living in Austin, Texas, with his 12-year-old daughter, Sarah. On the night of his birthday, a sudden outbreak of a severe brain infection originating from an unknown fungus spreads throughout the United States. As Joel and Sarah meet up with his brother Tommy, they attempt to flee the area. Joel and Sarah are briefly separated from Tommy as the latter keeps the infected at bay. Joel and Sarah continue to flee, and they encounter a lone soldier who is ordered to fire on them. He does, and Joel and Sarah fall down a hill, separated from each other briefly. When the soldier is about to execute Joel, he is shot in the head by Tommy. Joel survives the attack with minor injuries, but Sarah was fatally wounded and dies in Joel's arms.
Sarah? Move your hands, baby. I know, baby, I know. Listen to me, I know this hurts, baby. You're gonna be okay, baby. Stay with me. All right, I'm gonna pick you up. I know, baby, I know it hurts.
This opening sequence still hits like an absolute freight train, made sort of double by the facial expressions. I mean, the clarity on the faces on those close-ups is insane. Like, you see every weird wrinkle on Joel's face. Yeah, I mean, I had the HDR cranked up, so the colors really popped. Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about, I guess, the detail they added to the world here. Is there anything in particular that jumped out at you in this initial sequence, or things that you noticed were different or felt different?
Yeah, so first, before I even answer that, I will say that I only have I don't have HDR on my TVs, and I played on 1080p, so there were definitely things that I probably couldn't notice on my experience, and we'll go through that more as we talk about the game more. In the prologue, I definitely noticed, specifically in the scene where where you're in the car and you're Sarah looking around. I noticed that the game, I don't even know how to quite explain this, but it does this thing with the camera where it makes things like almost like it's a wider shot so you can see more. Something I noticed even before this game came out and before this was even an inkling in our minds, was when I would originally play it, turning around as Sarah and trying to observe everything around me was cool, but it felt a little claustrophobic and it felt like there was just something lacking. But it was sort of like, well, it's a video game, so that's going to happen. You can't totally create real life like things or how you experience them. Where this time it felt like much more realistic in its portrayal of turning around the car and seeing things. Like you could actually see the full picture of the house burning, like when you pass by it, versus in the original, again, you can see it and it's fine, but there's just something about it where like it will get cut off too quickly, or like just certain scenes they pass by a little too fast, or there's motion blur or something. So I just found there was a lot more clarity in circumstances like that. And also, as a note, like we should also, I guess, talk about the fact that like the graphics in the original are they're not bad at all.
Yeah.
But I will say that there's a sort of deadness to the eyes at times in certain scenes.
Yeah, the art style they went for in the original is very much it's sort of blending between realistic and kind of watercolor look almost, to try and work around some of the limitations. And yeah, one of the accidental side effects of that is sometimes when characters are talking, there is just like no reflection or subsurface scattering in the eyes at all.
Yeah.
And yeah, it can have that effect of like, is that a mannequin?
Yeah. And that's the thing, like, again, like, I guess we'll talk about this more as we go along, but like, again, the graphics were never bad, so that's why it was kind of weird for me when they announced this remake, because I was like, oh, well, okay, like, the graphics aren't bad, but whatever. But that being said, you can definitely see the improvements. Specifically, like, Joel, we already knew because we played part 2. We saw what improved graphics could look like with him. But specifically with Sarah, her model just looks better. She's able to emote better. And I think in a subtle way, I don't want to say I empathize with her more, because obviously I empathize with her when I played the game originally. Like, how can you not? But it felt like there was a bit more closeness to her, I guess.
Yeah,
because
the acting micro expressions and the like, you get a closer picture of the full performance from the actors, right? Like, I think that's that's what makes you connect more, is like you get a fuller picture of like, well, what were they actually doing on set that day that they captured with the facial capture, and they were able to kind of render that a bit clearer. I've seen an argument a few times, which is that, you know, this version of the game is a revision of the game that came out to make it closer to what they wanted that game to be. Like, if they could have waved a magic wand, this is what it would look like. And I get where that argument is coming from. I think there's a lot of things they did, or a lot of minor decisions they made in this, with the knowledge and the hindsight of where part 2 goes. I think it's a bit disingenuous to suggest that this is sort of a revision to make it what they originally wanted. I think instead, I would say, my impression is, this is a revision to try and align a standalone project with the sequel that they kind of ended up adding to it. That's kind of the impression I get. Like we said in The Last of Us Part 2, you can tell from a narrative perspective, they didn't have a plan for a sequel when they finished writing this. And there's decisions they make here that I think resonate with that, particularly around Joel. Something I've noticed as I've played through, and I'll talk about it a bit more at Boston QZ because it becomes really obvious there, Joel looks way worse. He just looks worse. Like, he looks more haggard. He's lost whatever that kind of like Chris Hemsworth sort of ruggedness he had, and he just looks tired and worn down. in a way that I think he didn't in the original. They wanted that for him, but he really like. Well, we'll talk about when we get to Boston, but he looks like crap, and that's really important. Yeah. That's really important for the context of the story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I building off of that real quick. I know that like when I first started playing, originally my sort of hesitancy as well toward this game was the fact that the new looks that we got to see in part 2 of Joel and Ellie, since there was a whole controversy of Ellie being modeled after Elliot Page. Nobody was talking about it, but I noticed it so much in part 2 in like the flashbacks. Her model just looked so different, and admittedly it actually did bother me. After playing this, I'm totally okay with it. I think her model looks infinitely better, but in terms of Joel, I wasn't sure how to feel about it, because I think in the original he just looks angry all the time.
Yeah, he does.
And,
yeah,
but there's like a point to that. Like I liked that, and I kind of feel like these new visuals make him look almost more sympathetic looking. Like he looks just sadder.
He looks sad all the time. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
don't dislike it.
I don't dislike it
It's
either.
just-
I think I know what they're doing. I think I know what they're trying to do. I'll elaborate in some detail and get to QZ, because I think that's really where that's really where I think that a decision they make about Tess is where it all comes together for me, and I can kind of see I can see through the Druckmann lens of the guy who genius, dunce who thinks he's smart, wavelength.
Yeah.
I want to talk really quickly about something I noticed this time, which is the added detail of Joel's neighborhood and Joel's house. Like you said, the clarity of what's going on is it's very clear and sharp. Like I played this on I have a very high def TV. I played it I've got the HDMI 2. Like I did all the things that the guy at the shop was like, if you're gonna buy an expensive TV and put your PS5 and you need these, I did all the things. Okay. And so I get the fullest experience, and I'm the guy that isn't going to notice the difference, but I did that anyway. And something I noticed is the detail here is fascinating, and I picked up on stuff I didn't otherwise. I want to read you a quote. This is me when I was something I wrote right after the game came out, which is in my article, The Last of Us to Kill a City. I was thinking about the fidelity of Joel's house and the implications for the story. So I sort of said the following, and I'll expand on it a little bit. So quote, "Before the end of the world, Joel is an island. He lives in a huge, comfortable slice of suburbia in Texas. His yard is large and well kept. Yet the televisions and the fancy grill and the beer fridge and the kitted out study. An entire world curated and designed. This man never believed in the mythic city, never believed in the greater organism. This man has a gun in his desk drawer, ready to shoot his neighbor at the drop of a hat. Because in some absurd way, he was always ready for this moment. Always ready for the illusion to shatter because he always stood beyond. He doesn't need the world outside." Something I really picked up on this time is, Joel lives in this really nice big house, but the first line of dialogue we get from him is this frustration that he needs this contract. Like, he's a contractor. He's not on a salary. He's a contractor who works in construction or something like that. And there's a way in which the second you kind of soak in that detail and the context, it becomes really clear that Joel is like a cornered rat, right? He's sort of living well beyond his means to achieve this specific lifestyle. On episode 505 of Waypoint Radio, Matthew Galt referred to these people as $30,000 millionaires, which is such a good turn of phrase. Which, he's referring to men in Texas who make like $30,000 a year, but they live with the trappings of millionaires by like piling loan on top of loan on top of loan, where, one slight disaster, they would lose everything. If they got sick, that's it, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. We called them $30,000 millionaires in Texas. There's just a ton of people with
wow.
that
That's
were making
a new one.
There were a ton of people in Texas making $30,000 a year, living like they were millionaires in these weird McMansions they were renting from people that lived in Florida that owned a bunch of property in North Texas, and would live like this. Would spend everything on the trappings of. I mean, it seems cliche, but it's real. I lived there. Like, would spend all the money they had on the trappings of letting everyone know that they were well off, and they were all cornered rats that were like one disaster away from, moving back into.
There's a natural tension that creates with the rest of reality, where you're sort of living in a way that isn't sustainable, and there's an insulation that seems to create, and you kind of see that in Joel in the way that he, the second that the people on the road need his help, he's like, we're not stopping. Like, it's not up for discussion, right? He's pretty ready to leave Tommy in the city almost immediately. He's just like, it's me and it's Sarah, and we're getting out of here, and that's all that matters. And there's a way that I think this sets up what they try and do with his character a lot clearer, because, and maybe it's just because I was coming to it with a different perspective, like I was trying to focus on this stuff, but the detail in the house, the gadgets and the grill, like all this stuff, I noticed it because it was so clear. And it really sets up a guy who, like, he was trapped before things went wrong, and there's like not relief, but there's a sense of like, this isn't, if Sarah had survived, this wouldn't have been the worst thing for him. And that's a really interesting characterization, I think, that, as you said, changes some of the context of how we understand this story.
Yeah, for sure. And to your point too, like, just again with going back to the improved visuals, like, there are objects around this house that, might have been a little blurred or pixelated before, that are now are just clear and crisp and just give you so much more detail about the lives that Joel and Sarah were living, in a way that you wouldn't expect. And I know, again, to your other point where you're saying maybe because you're looking at this with, a different lens, I don't know how I'd feel if I'd never played the game before and was coming to this for the first time. But, replaying it and having this new perspective, like, it did give more depth to the story in a way I didn't expect it to, which, I guess we should expect of our games, like, because that's how games are using environment to tell us a story. So if the first game, or the original was lacking
God, it gets
a
hard
little.
to talk about, doesn't it?
I know, like, if the original, and whenever I say original, I'm referring really to the remastered version, because that's the version I played. But in the original, it's not, I love that game. It's not bad by any means, but part one is basically taking it and saying, hey, how can we make it like a little better? And I think just establishing these little details, like you said, really build on it and make you think about it different. Like, I never thought about that.
Yeah.
Even when I was playing, I didn't think about it, but now that you're mentioning it, I'm like, yeah, that totally makes sense. It's little details like that. That's just really good.
It just all of that stuff hits better. Like, I think that's really what it comes down to is, and this is sort of my point about this feeling like a revision of the manuscript rather than a reprinting, I guess. And there's something about that which is really compelling to me. I'm struggling to articulate exactly what I mean by that. Rather than going, hey, we just put the new graphics on this, they made some artistic choices in revising those graphics that, so Joel, okay, we should talk about the QZ, because I think that's where it becomes really, really evident for me as I'm playing through it. And that's where I actually, like, the game made me fully stop what I was doing and go, hang on, I've never noticed this before. Like, how did I not realize this is what the game is about? And that's really interesting to me, because I don't think the previous game is about some of those things. I think it wants to be, but it never quite can be because of the limitations of what it's working with. So, okay, do you have any more notes on the prologue?
No, I'm ready to move on.
All right. Sarah's death, still absolutely devastating, by the way, if you're wondering.
Even more devastating.
Yeah, truly. The facial expression that they get out of that actress's performance is even more, it's more heartbreaking than it's ever been. Absolutely brutal.
Yeah, for sure.
And cannot be conveyed in a compressed YouTube video. Like, you have to watch the game run it. It's absolutely devastating.
It is. And, it was, again, just pointing back to the improved visuals here, because it was always devastating. And I think a lot of that had to do less with the visuals and more with the voice acting. I apologize, I don't know the voice actors for Sarah, but she does an incredible job. That is heartbreaking, the scene when she dies. Like, obviously heartbreaking just because his daughter is dying, but her performance is...
God, it's breathtaking.
It's gut-wrenching.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When she's sort of like pawing at him, and the detail that they get out of her eyes in that moment is like, fuck, like it hits so much harder.
It does.
Yeah, it's what a way to start a story, by the way. I've been saying this for months, but this, I don't know tonally how they're gonna try and do the TV show, because you can't do shit like this on television, or you couldn't before Game of Thrones, I guess. I'm interested to see if they pull their punch on this, or if they even show it. I don't know.
I am interested to see that, just because, well, you know, I'm not even going to say. We'll get off topic if I say. But yeah, we'll have to talk about that when that comes out.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll just be talking about The Last of Us forever.
Forever, yeah. It's just
so. I mean, look, stuff to say. Okay, so
I love it. So
well, this is the thing about Naughty Dog, is they have a way of like, they're gonna keep remastering everything until the end of time, so we're gonna have new things to talk about.
We're gonna have The Last of Us Part 2.
Oh no! Oh god! Imagine The Last of Us Part 3. God.
Honestly, I could see it.
Well, you play as Ellie's kid anyway. Okay.
Oh.
I shouldn't give Druckmann ideas. The game cuts to 20 years later in the summer of 2033. Joel is now a smuggler in a bleak post-apocalyptic society in the Boston quarantine zone with his partner and friend Tess, where they subsequently sneak out of the city to illegally trade with other survivors or bruise up folk. The two set out to look for a local arms dealer named Robert, who stole guns from them. When they find him, he confesses he sold the guns because he owed them to the Fireflies. Angered by this, Tess shoots Robert twice in the head, and then the two decide to look for the Fireflies and try and retrieve their merchandise. Shortly after, they encounter Marlene, the head of the Fireflies, and she tells them she'll part with the guns and double the payment if they agree to smuggle something out of the city. At the safe house that Marlene takes them to, it's revealed that they will be smuggling a young girl by the name of Ellie. Tess and Joel split up, with Tess following Marlene back to her camp to confirm she has their payment, while Joel escorts Ellie back to their own safe house to wait for Tess. When Tess returns, the three of them set off for the drop point that other Fireflies will be waiting at to receive Ellie at the Capitol building. So, a few things that called out here, like that I was kind of alluding to. So the first thing I want to talk about is Joel looks way older and way sadder, which is really important for the context of the type of character they're trying to create. And Tess looks completely different. I don't know if you've seen the side-by-sides, but she is like a different person. Like...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's not the only one, but yeah, she does look like a different character.
Yeah. She actually looks like she's Joel's age. Like you suddenly go, oh, she was supposed to be his age. Like, and it suddenly, like, a lot of things start to click and you're like, okay, I get it.
Yeah. As a quick aside too, I think her new look, because again, I was sort of stingy about everybody's new look, and seeing her and actually playing through the game sort of cemented, okay, I think I'm on board with this, because again, it's weird how so much more context is given because she looks different and because she looks so much better. Like, I know there's like a part of dialogue right before her death where she says to Joel, like, come on, like, there must be something here, like, that she's alluding to, like, maybe a past relationship between the two of them. Mm-hmm. And that was the only thing when I originally played the game that made me go, oh, like, they were together? Are they together? Like, I never got that. Maybe because she did look younger, and also just the limitation of the graphics. Now, playing through it in the part 1 version, you can see so much, like, through their facial expressions. Mm-hmm. It's incredible, again, just the little changes that allow us to gain so much context.
And it's from their first interaction as well. Yeah. Their first interaction, I'm like, oh, that was a bit floaty. Like, and it's sort of, it's funny how it shouldn't make that much of a difference. Like, I'm not a graphics guy generally, but you're right, it's the detail of the expressions they're able to achieve. and it's the fidelity of the movements as well. Like you just get so much more of the tension between them. I think it sets it up really well. The thing they're doing with Joel here that I think is really interesting is Joel looking older and looking like crap has this very specific kind of outcome for the way that we view him. Like, there's a maneuver that the original game does where they sort of want him to be kind of like a suburban cowboy. Like, he sort of has this kind of Western motif to him. Obviously, he's from Texas, and Troy Baker's doing an incredible Texan accent. But thematically, he is supposed to be this kind of Western frontiersman, and we see that fully expanded and realized in part 2. But for me, the affect of making him kind of older and looking a bit crapper and just more run down and more sad, they're sort of going less for the like early days Clint Eastwood gunslinger and more for like the later washed up Clint Eastwood look. And there's kind of there's a maneuver that does with the way that you view him like you said, in the original ones, he kind of looks very angry, and here by making him sadder, and sadder isn't necessarily the right adjective, but it's the closest sort of summary of it. He just looks more worn down, and it means that when he is moved to violence, it feels a lot more. Not that he's hesitant to do it exactly, but when he is moved to acts of violence, there's a reticence or there's a weariness to it as a result. When you first have that confrontation where Tess shoots Robert, you get a brief expression from Joel that is like, oh, for fuck's sake, like I'm getting to like this again. And that really does something with his character, where then later on, when he's doing acts of violence, and the expressions and the body language changes as he's doing them, you really feel that change. You really feel this guy who's like hung up the boots and hung up the 6-shooter. You really feel that change later on when, there's a moment in the ski lodge where he's torturing 2 guys, and you feel him want to do it. Like, you feel him like, you from that performance, he wants to do this. He wants to hurt these people, and you see that arc for him as he, at once regains some of his humanity through Ellie. A result of that is he also regains the violence he was trying to leave behind. And that those two things working in tension with each other is obviously the plot of The Last of Us. Obviously, the story is girl with cure, get cure to hospital, but the plot is that the dichotomy of those two things being in tension. And this sets that up really well, where even from the very first, he and Tess feel like they've been doing this a long time. They feel like these old kind of weary gangsters. They're basically just like mobsters, right? Like, they're just kind of like common crooks. And they feel like they're done. Like, they're at the end of this, like, they're running out of steam. They've pissed off all the wrong people. And then, hey, this is our opportunity to like make it big and kind of settle down, right? That's what they're talking about doing. And I very much felt that a lot more this time because of their interactions and Joel's, the decision they made with Joel, I guess, which was to bring him closer to the Last of Us Part 2 version. Yeah, and speaking of the Part 2 version, I always got this sense, like, when I played Part 2, that part of his new look was a way for, I guess, the developers to kind of want you to empathize with him more. Not that we weren't empathizing with him, but just that, obviously his actions at the end of Part 1 are not the greatest. And, we could debate, this back and forth, but like, I think there's some not good vibes from the decision he makes. Understand why he did it. Look, I want to be clear. He's a bad dude this entire story. This entire game, he's a bad dude doing bad stuff. He's selfish. He's conservative. He is kind of fashy at times. Like, he's a bad dude, but the exercise of this game is like, hey, can bad people do good things and build relationships? Right. Turns out Not
I think-
really, without being a toxic piece of crap. But that's that's part of it.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
it. Yeah, that's the exploration.
You said it. You said it a lot better than I did, because I was like sort of being like hesitant about it, because I feel like the developers were like, oh my god, like there's a big group of people who just like do not empathize with Joel. So his new look, when I first saw it, was kind of like he just looked nicer, and like I guess we've been using the term sad, which I agree is not the right term necessarily, but it's like the one I keep coming back to, because he just looks like kind of a sad older guy who's just like kind of done with life, and playing through part 2 and seeing him play guitar with Ellie and just all that, it was almost like it felt like a different character at first. So going back to what you were saying about sort of this recontextualization of him and sort of the different sort of cowboy looks, I agree. There is definitely something happening where I don't want to say it's like revisionist, but it is getting across a different sort of character that might have not been, they weren't able to get across in the original game.
I think it's I don't know. I'm tempted to say it is revisionist only because I don't know. This feels kind of deliberate to me. You can make sad old guys on the old hardware. That God of War game, Kratos is a sad old guy. He's the saddest old guy you've ever met in your entire life. Whereas I think they're definitely original Joel, OG Joel, kind of feels like he's a bit kind of handsome and he's kind of a dark, brooding character. You're right. This version, they take away some of that, and he's just more like there's a bit less of that kind of. There's less violent. It's so hard to try and describe. He's less handsome and he's more worn down, and the result of that is he feels more reluctant to be doing any of this, and that reluctance gives him, like you said, makes it a bit easier to be like, well, he doesn't really want to do this, so it makes it a bit easier to empathize when he does do things where it's like, oh well, he was pushed into this, he doesn't want to be here anyway, so yeah, of course he made the wrong choice, which is like not an excuse for being a piece of shit, but that's the work of this story, I guess, is rendering that really clearly, and this seems to get a better stab at that by taking what they wanted him to be in part 2 and sort of revising this draft not significantly. The equivalent of this in a novel would be if you didn't change any of the dialogue in a novel, but you change the description of the gestures around the dialogue, because that's what changes context of how you understand dialogue, right? If someone says a line and it crosses their arms, that communicates to you something about the way that line was said. If in a second draft, instead of crossing their arms, they, scratch their beard or something, that changes the context of how you understood what was said. And so this feels like that maneuver, but at a technology and a character modeling level, where they're subtly changing the underlying behavioral context. It's hard because the acting's the same, but the way that we understand the acting is different because the models are revised and the graphics are higher fidelity. So that it's really, that's why we're struggling to talk about it, is it's a very intangible thing.
Yeah, and also a quick note, I kind of go back on what I just said about saying it's not revisionist, because hell, this whole thing is a revisionist experiment, essentially. That's all they're doing is revising, so I do take that back, because...
I guess the story isn't, though. Like, the point I was trying to make
the story isn't.
Yeah, like, they haven't... I get, because it's true, because if you were going to say, like, oh, this is a remake, you would expect, they've, like, a Dead Space remake, they've re-recorded all the dialogue, they've changed some of the game's underlying structure, there's now, like, an open world component to it, like, they've remade, like, they've fundamentally changed the story as a result of that, even though it's the same narrative. This is the same dialogue, right? Like, they haven't added content.
Right.
So in that sense, it isn't a revision of the story, but it is a revisionist piece of art, I guess is what I was trying to pull apart there. Two separate ideas. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
One other thing I noticed, which I'll talk about as we go through the game, is when you first come out of the building and you see the skyline, I was absolutely stunned. The visuals of downtown Boston when you sort of looking over the wall, and you've just got this city in complete disrepair, in such clarity. It looked so real. And I don't mean that in the sense of like, it was photorealistic. I meant that the feeling of it was so tangible that I kind of just stopped and I went, holy shit. Like I was dead in my tracks, just staring at this. The thing that caught my eye was the attention to detail on like, a skyscraper had sort of fallen into another one. And like the floor that had contacted the other building, the glass had broken and the contents had spilled out. And you could see like from a distance, a desk chair, lodged into a piece of glass just hanging out the side. And the specificity of those details made me go, holy crap, like this could happen. And it was the first time I've ever really had that sensation of like playing through a post-apocalyptic space. I suddenly went, oh, this could happen in my city. Like this isn't that removed from reality. And it was really confronting. And that was sort of what I ended up writing about it, I guess, in my first article. I've talked before about the idea of like urban dread or suburban dread, depending on the flavor of where you come at it from as a thematic idea. That's obviously, The Walking Dead is really about that in a really specific kind of way. I'm deep in the weeds of that video essay at the moment. And one of the things that this game attempts to do that story doesn't, it's probably more in the style of like The Road by Kerouac or something like that, is it's not unlike the part 2, and this is something that I know part of what I wanted to talk about and why I messaged you, is part of what we talked about in part 2 is really about what does it look like when these spaces are recolonized by different factions, right? You have 3 key factions in that story. You have Jackson, which is your kind of quote-unquote good frontier town. And then you have the Scars, so the Seraphites, which are your sort of, without being too on the nose with Druckmann's obvious allegory, those are obviously supposed to be like, the Israeli people, and then you have the militaristic outsiders that are coming in, which are the WLF, who are the invading force, and those are kind of your 3. But they all fundamentally exist within the world and have their own structure and culture and society. This game has none of that. It is just the world's over and everything is broken, and the specific detail in that moment. Where I just stood there and I just kind of like panned the camera and just sort of soaked in the city and the specific details. And I was just absolutely like awestruck by the specificity here was rather than what my experience was in the first game, which is like that these are spaces where you might have encounters, right? Where you might come across clickers, which is, by the way, zombies still terrifying. We'll talk about it as we go through it. But for me, what it ended up being was rather than what was contained within the spaces, the thing I ended up focusing on is what was absent in the spaces. So you go into a bedroom and someone was half finished packing, and it was what they'd left behind. Or it was the stuff they hadn't bothered to take, or the stuff that had broken as they left. The things that were very, very, very important when people lived here that now don't matter at all. And that sounds obvious to say, but the clarity of how they are able to achieve that in this game, it just kind of like the whole time I was playing it, right up until that final chapter where you're sort of in spring, I think, and you're sort of heading toward the hospital. Right up until then, the entire time, as I was playing through, I just had this like gnawing sense of dread that just kind of like sat in my chest as I was going through these spaces. Like this really kind of like calcified what they were trying to achieve for me, and really changed my experience. Like And that was part of that was like, yeah, I walked through all these spaces, like I really took my time. But the other part is like, goddamn, this game, they get like whatever it is they were trying to do, they do it. Like it works. Yeah, I cannot stress enough how affecting I found this time around. But I've never had that feeling before. But playing through it this time, I was like, God, there's obviously we're in different parts of our life than when we first played this. I'm a homeowner now, so that could be part of it. I'm obviously a bit older. Whatever all those things are, the way that this hit me was so different. I'm so impressed.
It is impressive, honestly, and I definitely got that sense too. That it really hit me more when it hit me in that first shot, like when you're seeing the Boston QZ, but it hit me more when you're with Ellie, and it's nighttime, and you had just escaped is it Fedra, I believe?
Yeah.
I always get I wasn't. As a note, I was never really aware of Fedra until part 2, so now I was paying attention to that more. Or I didn't even know they were Fedra. But anyway, so after that point, when Tess is like, or Ellie's explaining, more of the situation, and you get a shot of, I guess like a top, or not top down, panning down shot of the outside of the QZ. And just seeing the buildings and seeing like so much behind them and just the clarity of it and just seeing the whole scope of the city just amazed me the first time I saw it. I was like, wow, this fundamentally changes how I'm viewing this or experiencing this game in a way that, as we've said multiple times, is really hard to explain. But it just gives you a context of like this world is so much bigger, like, because so I have to stress once again that I love the original Last of Us, and so this is not a diss against the game, but there are some aspects to it that playing this now, going back, like, make me think like, oh, it just felt a little video gamey, like in a way that's not bad, that's not an insult necessarily, but just to say that sometimes a city in a game is a city in a game.
There's a central area with some generic guys shooting at targets, some rooms off to the side with a couple of people you can talk to a little, but there's nothing you can really gain from them. Nothing really happens here. It's like a Brotherhood of Steel themed attraction at a park. It doesn't feel like a place, and the Brotherhood doesn't feel like a cohesive group. In Fallout 1, the Brotherhood of Steel was a place you could get quite invested in learning about, with a multifaceted membership. The Brotherhood weren't just a place you could get guns and plot.
Where this felt like, wow, like this feels like the world. Like this feels like my world, my Boston. Like it felt much more, it hit home a bit more than the original did because of those improved graphics.
There's a thing that I noticed for the first time ever in Red Dead Redemption 2, actually, where that game had the same level of fidelity for all of the background details as it did with stuff you interacted with or people you met. And that level of that sort of everything being highly detailed in the same level of detail was what made that game feel like a real world. Because I think a lot of old video games, it was like, you could tell what was interactable because it had the high quality texture on it. And I think the first game has a bit of that to an extent where there are places they had to necessarily cut corners. Whereas here, they get to just throw money at you every second, every frame. They're just throwing money at you with what they're able to achieve.
Can I, as a note too, because I know we keep talking about the graphics, mostly because of the context that changes with the new graphics, but I also want to make a point in saying that typically, like, I feel like me saying all these things is out of the norm of how I usually feel. Like, I feel a lot of people are so hell-bent on good graphics, and I'm not really about that. Like, I'm okay with a game not having the best graphics. And I think a lot of games today are so focused on that they almost lose sight of like making a good game in general. It just, it looks good, so that's all that matters. I know there's more to it than just that, and I'm being very simplistic here, but I think this is sort of out of the norm. when we talk about it?
Yeah, I would say for both of us. I mean, if you look at our body of work, the thing we're interested in is like how do stories work and what like how do they function and how do we receive them. I don't think anybody watching this is like Danielle and David, two big graphics heads. Like, you know what I mean? Like, so yeah, but I think it's worth clarifying. Yeah. Perhaps the way to say it is, it's the first time I've played a project where I felt like the decisions around the technology directly influenced the way that I understood the writing and the story and the plot.
Which is a good way to put it.
Yeah. Probably in the absence of like horror, because that specifically is that relies on things like lighting and sound design and things like that. In the same way that when I first played Dead Space, I was like, oh, I never realized how important sound design and lighting is for a game's atmosphere or a game telling a story. This is the same thing, but for like world detail, for want of a better word. It really is fundamental to the project they're trying to do.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, well, maybe let's talk about the Boston streets, because I think there's a little bit to say there. As you alluded to, that was, I think, for me as well, where the kind of world started to broaden for me as well. So before they get very far, two patrolling military members ambush them, and they are subjected to a scan for CBI, which is the cordyceps brain infection, and call for backup. Tess and Joel pass the scan, but before they can get a look at Ellie's reading, Ellie panics and stabs the soldier with a switchblade. Joel and Ellie absolutely murk these soldiers instantly. It is brutal to watch. Ellie reveals she's infected, but claims her bite is 3 weeks old. Joel remains skeptical, but they escape together as more soldiers arrive, forcing them to flee underground. Once the soldiers lose track of them, Ellie explains that Marlene believes what happened to her may be the key to finding a cure. Joel is naturally reluctant, but Tess believes there may be some truth to what she's saying and urges him to consider finishing the drop-off. The three fight their way through numerous infected to the Capitol building, only to find the fireflies that were supposed to meet them have been slaughtered. Joel declares they tried and failed and proposes they head home, but Tess reveals she's been bitten on the way to the building.
Guess what? We're shitty people, Joel. It's been that way for a long time.
No, we are survivors.
This is our chance.
It is over, Tess! Now, we tried. Let's just go home.
I'm not going anywhere. This is my last stop.
What?
Our luck had to run out sooner or later.
You going on?
No, don't touch me.
Holy shit. She's infected.
Tess begs Joel to bring Ellie to Tommy, as he used to be part of the Fireflies, and might have an idea of how to get her to Marlene. Tess stays behind alone to cover them against the approaching soldiers, as Joel reluctantly flees with Ellie. Like we said, this sequence in the rain is pretty spectacular. The city at nighttime with the storm and the water. I gotta say, the water in this game looks stupid good. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's like the 60 frames. Maybe it's like the HDR. I don't know. But there's something happening when I was playing this on my TV where anytime there was water involved, I was just like, it just looks like real water. And that's like, that sounds so stupid. But it, I always think that one of the best water looks in video games was that Assassin's Creed Black Flag. This isn't water in a video game. This is just straight up water from real life. I don't know how they've done these sims, but it does just looks pretty stunning. And really,
it looks good. Yeah.
Really makes you feel like an old guy crawling through a sewer,
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. Yeah. I definitely noticed the water looks good. That's some kind of one of my obsessions, admittedly, when I play games. That and like, it's a weird obsession to have, but like paying attention to footprints characters leave behind. Like I'm always obsessed with that. So like I'm always paying attention to those two things. And every time, like one detail I noticed too is that whenever you're in the water, like your clothes like will stay wet for long periods of time. I noticed like they don't just kind of auto dry like they typically do in games. Like you're when you're in the water, you're drenched and you're gonna be that way for a while. And I love that detail. And
I like that the cutscenes are persistent as well. So if you're wet walking into a cutscene, Joel's just a wet guy having a conversation. Or if he's covered in blood, he's just a guy covered in blood having a conversation. And that in the same way that Red Dead 2, it works for exactly all those reasons. This really elevates some of the stuff here. Particularly after you go through like a really brutal combat sequence or something. And Joel's just like clearly injured. He's got a band-aid on. He's just like covered in blood, and they're talking about something. And you really feel like his just constant reluctance to everything. Yeah, it's really good. I did have this is where I had the particular moment that incited me to write the articles I ended up writing, which is I was going through an office building, and it was clearly a tech startup, and it was the same U shape as my office at work. Like it was the same layout. The windows were in roughly the same place, and it was the weirdest deja vu because like walking through this space, like all the desk chairs are like, some of them are kicked over, a bunch of the screens have been knocked over as people have rushed out. Like the kitchen's half abandoned. There's all this cutlery like spilling from a half broken drawer. The boardroom's abandoned and like the glass wall's broken. And I was just like, I stood there and had that moment of, oh shit, like this could be my office. This could happen. And that was where that sense of like that feeling of urban dread really like settled in. Because it's so mundane. It's just an office. It's so mundane, and that's what makes it so arresting. Is there's nothing special about this office. This is one of like 1,000 offices in that city, and it doesn't matter at all in the grand scheme of anything. No one cares about this office, but there were people that worked here and came here and lived here and made friendships and fell in love and made money and lost jobs and fired and had complicated rivalries and friendships and none of that matters. It is just an empty place where Joel can pick up some cloth and some rubbing alcohol. These spaces have lost their function because they never really had one. The notion that they had function and utility was imagined. It was made up. It's fiction. The idea of a city is it's a collective fabrication. It's a collective fantasy that we've all agreed to. And this for me really highlighted I guess the thinness or the futility of the human project in the face of just the scale of this destruction. Like you said before, the sense that this is a world and a city that exists. This moment for me where I was able to look at a specific detail, all of that stuff kind of collapsed in on top of me, and I really had that moment of complete realization that society, us functioning as people, this thing is like paper thin, and all it would take is a really bad day for it to all go away, and here is what remains afterwards. Here, it's just the debris of these people's lives. It's the belongings left behind. It's these spaces that no longer have purpose. And that was really, really affecting for me this time in a way that I've never, like I said at the start, I've never really felt that before. And it really hit home this time for me.
That's really interesting, especially because I do have to agree, going back to those little details that they're able to establish, I noticed them much more. While I don't work in the city or in an office building like that, at the same time, I have friends who do and have been in buildings like that. And I will say that it's not like that was something that did occur to me in the original game, though it occurred much later. For me, it was on the college campus when I originally played. Mm-hmm. And I originally played the game as a note in January 2020, right before the COVID pandemic went down. And I remember playing and thinking, God, imagine if something just crazy like this happened to our society. Imagine. Yeah. But anyway, going back to the little details and stuff. Yeah, just noticing them this early on. And just again having new context for being in this area that because I played the game quite a few times since first playing it, and I know it pretty well at this point. Being able to play it and experience it with this freshness was very striking and surprising. because again, there are these little details that aren't pixelated, they're much clearer, and they're able to, I guess, make you once again just recognize that you're not just walking through a space to get from point A to point B. You're walking through a building where people worked. Like,
yeah,
it's like remnants of the world that Joel once inhabited. And that's another thing too. Like, when I first played the game, Ellie says something to Joel where when they're waiting for Tess, she keeps saying like, I've never been outside before. And I initially misunderstood that because when I first played, I'm like, what are you talking about? Did you mean like outside? And then obviously I picked up on, oh, okay, she means outside the quarantine zone.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's interesting because I felt it more from like Ellie's perspective as well this time, of just like walking outdoors, feeling the environment of everything and imagining like it did feel distinctly different from being inside the QZ.
Yeah.
And so I think that resonated with me more this time as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. To your point there about I guess resonating with Ellie's kind of experience. For me this time, the thing that really struck me is how absurd she finds a lot of the ideas of the old world, where she's like, "Oh, you really did that." You're clearly making that up, because it seems so absurd and it seems so frivolous, and it's beyond conception for her that people used to live in these particular ways, because walking through these spaces, they just have no relationship to that version of reality other than the detritus of that past society. And I completely agree. I definitely felt her kind of her sense of disreality coming out of the quarantine zone and just sort of realizing what the world is now and what it trying to work backwards to what it was, and really struggling because of how different it is now. Yeah, it's goddamn, that's what an achievement. I'm just continually I'm continually impressed by how strongly this project gets to evoke things that I've just never had experience before in the original work. A plus revision, guys.
Yeah.
It's
good.
It's good, actually.
Yeah. Did you know?
Okay, so I don't have a lot of more other notes on Boston. Tess's death still hits pretty hard. One thing I will say is when you first pick up that rifle, these games have little moments like this from time to time. But normally when I play these games, I always try and do the stealthy approach like every time, because I'm like, I've got to conserve the stuff. But I was like, well, what would Joel do? Tess just died. He's going to pull out this gun. He's going to start shooting some motherfuckers. And so I tried to roleplay as Joel a bit more this time around. And so I just stood there and went bop, 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 bop in that hallway and then charged him down. And I was like bricking dudes and just like went absolutely off the hook, trying to just like kill these guys as quickly as possible. And the all the vibrations and stuff are brilliant. This is no surprise to anyone. PS5, very good piece of machinery. Really, really good stuff. That DualShock, chef's kiss. The way that the sounds vibrate in the controller, it's all very good.
The tension when like you're shooting a bow and arrow. The way the triggers,
the haptic, adaptive. Oof. Yeah, it's good. It's good.
Damn.
Catch up, Xbox. What are we doing?
Yeah.
Me starting a console war that doesn't exist anymore. It's like no one's arguing between PlayStation and Xbox because you can't buy either of them anyway. So what's it matter?
Oh, so true.
Depressing. Okay, so on the road, Joel and Ellie are ambushed by hunters in Pittsburgh. Within the city, they meet a pair of brothers named Sam and Henry who are trying to escape, and they all agree to work together. In a confrontation with more hunters, Sam and Henry abandon Ellie and Joel, and the two are once again alone. As they leave the city, they are pursued by the hunters in a Humvee who chase Joel and Ellie to the edge of a broken bridge. Ellie proposes they jump off. Joel says no because Ellie can't swim. Ellie ignores him and jumps off anyway, and annoyed, Joel follows her. In the strong currents, Joel latches onto Ellie, but before they can do anything, he is knocked unconscious by slamming into a boulder. He's then awoken by Ellie on the shores of a beach where they are reunited with Sam and Henry. Angered, Joel shoves Sam down to the ground and points a gun at him, threatening to shoot him because they were abandoned. Henry explains they had to leave for Sam's safety and also says that they found Joel and Ellie in the water. Ellie agrees that they would have drowned if it wasn't for Sam. He puts the gun down and they all continue their journey to the radio tower. Soon they find an entrance to a sewer and navigate through it to reach a suburban neighborhood. Up in the suburbs, they're attacked by another group of hunters, including a sniper. Joel manages to take them out, but the noise from the fight attracts a huge horde of infected, which causes the group to flee the suburbs. Once they reach the radio tower, they spend the night indoors talking about past memories before the outbreak. And Joel talks about motorcycles. It's very funny. Joel, Ellie, and Henry are all in the main room talking while Sam is in the other. Ellie goes in to check on him, and Henry's taking stock of the food they have. Ellie notices that Sam is particularly upset, and they have a conversation about religion, becoming infected, and their roles in the world. After they talk, they say goodnight and spend the night in the radio tower. The next morning, they all wake up, and Henry is making breakfast. Ellie decides to wake Sam, only to discover he has been bitten in their latest encounter and turned overnight. He attacks Ellie, and Joel goes to shoot him, but Henry shoots the gun out of his hand.
That's my fucking brother.
Joel retrieves the gun again. A gunshot is heard, and as we pan, it turns out that Henry has shot Sam. In a state of anger and grief, Henry is about to shoot Joel. Joel basically says, hey, take it easy, this is no one's fault. And then Henry changes his mind and ends up taking his own life.
Sam. Henry? Henry, stay there. Henry? What have you done? I'm gonna get that gun from you, okay? Oh, okay, easy. This is your fault. This is nobody's fault, Henry. It's all your fault! Henry! Henry, no!
In a pretty confronting sequence of events.
Yeah.
Once again, I think the sequence works pretty much as well as it does in the original. Yep. One of the accidental consequences of this revision, I think, is it. To your point earlier, there are parts of Pittsburgh, particularly the camp where you kind of break into before you flee and jump off the bridge. That kind of feels like a video game, whereas a lot of the other game doesn't. And I think it's just the sight lines and the visual aesthetic. It does just feel like a video game level, and it's the only part of the game which really does for me. I definitely noticed that more this time because of the clarity.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. Naughty Dog tends to do this a lot. I've noticed, particularly in the Uncharted games as well, where they'll just like put you in an arena and be like, fight all of these enemies. Like, we don't care how you do it. And that particularly feels very video gamey to me. So that didn't really change too much from, I guess, because it's like more of an enclosed environment too. I mean, you are outdoors, but like still, like it's still pretty tight. So it didn't really feel that different. So yeah, I would agree with you.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, there's a few things I want to call out. When you wake up on the beach, that sequence where you're walking down the beach and there's this like there's a ferry that's kind of like beached and it's sort of like rusted into the sand or whatever. I don't know what it was about that particular sequence, like that particular place, but that beach felt incredibly well realized. And like I was like, this is beautiful but also really depressing, and there's a wow, what a reduction. But it really had that melancholic feel of like I don't know, I'd never had that feeling before in that particular location. But you kind of, yeah, as you're walking through that beach and you're sort of there, and Sam and Henry are off kind of on a slightly separate route, and you're kind of working through that space. The sand and the beaches felt very, very tangible and tactile. And I think it's the water that runs, through the sand, and it's probably some technology thing, I'm sure, with like the subsurface scattering of the sand. There's something happening. But that for me, like, obviously I grew up in Brisbane, which is sort of very close to the beach, and it really just felt like beaches I've walked on as a kid. And that was a really refreshing experience that I wasn't expecting at all. Little known fact: it's really hard to do beaches well in video games. They either feel like not real places, or the sand just looks wrong, or the water doesn't really work. This is just it all just it really like it all clicks together really well. I noticed the same thing with the river near Tommy's Dam. That also had that sensation of feeling really of really well realized. But yeah, that ship on the beach, just for whatever reason, that imagery was very kind of melancholic, and that environment really put me in Joel's perspective for that sequence where he's sort of relieved, but you can tell that he doesn't you can tell he doesn't really trust Henry and Sam, and he's sort of frustrated that Ellie does, but it's not like he's not actually frustrated with her. He's frustrated at the situation, and it's nice that you get this little reflective moment of, you can kind of overhear them talking, and you and Ellie are talking, and you sort of get this nice little mirroring there, that nice little kind of rhyming of those two, which Struckman's a big fan of. Obviously, that becomes the central focus in part 2. But yeah, this sequence really, that bit in particular worked well for me, even if the Pittsburgh combat stuff and the sequencing and all that stuff still, like in the original, doesn't really work for me. But certainly the acting here in this environment, yeah, absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I also agree that like Pittsburgh is rough. Like, it's not that I dislike it, but it's definitely a low point of the game for me, because summer in general obviously is the longest section of the game, and it goes on for a really long time, and it includes one of my least favorite segments in the game, which is when you I believe you're in the hotel and you're trying to climb up the elevator, and Joel falls down into the basement. It is I hate it. In this version, it's extremely dark, so I actually turned up the brightness setting because I will admit it scares me. I don't like being down there.
It is creepy. It's creepy.
Yeah. And like, I get the aesthetic reasons for it, but I'm not here for it. I turned up the brightness, and I will say too, and this is like a gameplay note, that every time I'd play through that section, I remember it very well because it's my least favorite. So I always dread what's coming up. I don't know. I didn't notice they changed like too much in terms of combat, but I noticed specifically in certain areas, they seem to make it, I'll say easier for lack of a better word. I played on normal difficulty, which I always do. And I had a friend who played on easy, and I played that section for her. When you're playing on easy in that section, there's only one bloater. But when I played on normal, there was two. In this version, playing on normal, there was only one bloater. So I found that to be an interesting thing. I didn't notice it too much in terms of like most combat situations, but there were a few, and that one is one I'm thinking of particularly. Another note, going back to what you said about sort of...
Before we move on from that, did you end up... So do you kill that bloater, or do you try and give it the runaround and then escape?
I tried to give it the runaround, but I struggled, because in that situation you have to grab the key card and then go, and I was just like too overwhelmed by it. So I did kill him.
Okay, interesting.
What about you?
Well, so one of the things that because I didn't play on the permadeath, but I played on whatever the one is below that. So it's like the second hardest or whatever.
Grounded?
Yeah, grounded.
Grounded's the hardest, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, whatever the non-permadeath version of that is. And one of the things one of the things that makes you do a lot is you stop trying to clear areas of enemies, and you start trying to just find a path through as safely as you can. And so when you get to bosses like that, you cannot spend the ammo on, like, you cannot kill, like, it is too much ammo to kill them. It's going to take too long. You're going to use up all of your health resources. So you end up doing this like cat and mouse thing where you try and maneuver that bloater so that you can get through, get what you need, and then it's going to come, and you're like, crap, okay, and you need to sort of, and it becomes this like really intense like kind of game of cat and mouse. And then when you finally get away, and it makes you do that triangle mashing to open the doors. That is the most stressful thing of my entire life, because you know that thing is coming and you're like, quick, Joe, quick, pulling the door, and you're like, if this thing catches up to me, it's going to take away half of my health in one hit. It's going to be bad.
Yep.
And it works, incredibly well. There's a way in which that difficulty engenders a certain type of engagement with the kind of enemies that I think works as well as it does in part 2. Similar kind of vibe. I just really noticed it this time in some of those sequences where I was literally like, I can't kill these things. I don't have the resources. What are my other options?
Which is interesting you're talking about resources, because like this is obviously a game where resource management is extremely important, and this time around I've always been aware of that, but like I really tried to be strategic about how I approach certain areas. So for example, when I was around clickers, I would tend to have a game plan of actually like either using a bow and arrow to shoot them, or just like, no, if I shoot this one, then I need to be prepared to headshot the other one twice. Because I wanted to save my shivs to unlock doors, and get more materials. So like I was much more aware of that this time, and trying to be more proficient. I'm not that good at the game, I will admit that. That's why I don't play it in the hardest difficulty. I don't find it to be enjoyable. So because typically I'll have a handle of situations, but sometimes they'll get away from me and I will just completely expend all my resources. And I'm like, all right, so this sucks.
You're like, so I have a bandage and a smoke bomb left. Cool.
Right. Yeah. Oh God. Yeah. So luckily that didn't happen too much, but it did happen a few times, and it is what it is. It happens. But a final note I wanted to make was going back to Pittsburgh and just talking about the environments. Now it could be that I didn't play, I have a nice TV, but it's not going to exemplify sort of the beautiful visuals like a 4K TV would for a PS5. It still looks good, just you're not getting that full experience necessarily. One thing I noticed specifically in the bill sections, because you're kind of going through grass a lot and just backyards of homes. Granted, if I had the games side by side of like the original and part 1, maybe I'd notice a difference, but like I did not notice a difference at all in the game I was playing. Like I would never know that I was playing a game with enhanced graphics. It looked exactly the same to me from memory.
Yeah, I'd say that's probably accurate. I did completely skip Bill's section, which I didn't mean to do. But
I figured you just...
Yeah, there's just nothing to really say about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
That space didn't feel materially changed to me.
No. And again, nothing totally bad about it, but that sort of spoke to like my sort of hesitancy to begin with the graphical changes, because I was like, we're talking a lot about cutscenes and stuff, and cutscenes, but like moment to moment gameplay, this game felt exactly the same for me personally. Granted, again, I was playing it a little differently and interacting with the world differently, but in terms of the presentation of the game, like it felt like I was playing The Last of Us. Yeah, which is not a bad thing, but in certain environments, like it's more noticeable than others. Like when you're talking about being on the beach, like that was a point where I agree. It definitely felt different for me too, and honestly, I can't even like begin to explain why. Like I remember when I stepped on the boat, it felt different, and it felt like, wow, like people rode this boat. Like I don't know. It's weird. Like
it's very intangible.
Yeah.
The one thing I would say is two things that I think we should note. First is that this game comes with the full sort of now what is kind of becoming normal, which is like sort of the Sony first party. Even though it's Naughty Dog, we all know that Naughty Dog is basically a Sony studio. Has all the sort of now what are becoming standard Sony first party accessibility features. And there is a list that is very, very long and incredibly useful. So For anyone that's differently able at various different times, you've got so many different options. There's two that you should turn on immediately if you're replaying this. The first is the auto pickup. So whenever you walk up to an object, Joel will just pick it up. You don't need to press triangle. Turn that shit on in every game. I've got that on in God of War. I've got that on in everything. That's the best feature.
Why didn't I do that?
Yeah, it's the best thing ever. I don't need to press triangle. I walk up to the shiny thing, he pick it up. It's good. Thing number two is there's a hey, I just don't want to do the environmental puzzles. So if you never want to have to lift a plank again in your entire life, you just turn that on. When you get to an area, it's solved. That I had on as well because it just meant that I was able to actually focus on what I was doing. People are differently able at different times. There are lots of different reasons why you might need accessibility options, and the breadth and depth of what they have here is pretty sensational. And being able to do things like that, and that's an accessibility option of like time for me, where it's like, I have a pretty busy life. I have a lot of commitments, and so for me, the thing that the thing that accessibility feature let me do is better cater to the ability that I had at that time. If let's say like you break your arm, you might need a different accessibility option while you're recovering. I think a lot of people forget that situational ability and situational disability is as important and as common as what we would consider more typical, like, well, they're a disabled person, therefore they need accessibility options. I think we often underappreciate how important they are in general at giving people different options of how they can interact with a project like this. And so just worth noting, lots of them here. They're all really, really great. And some of them, like that. Those two ones in particular just made my experience a lot cleaner and more consistent. And I was able to sort of, as I said, when I was walking through these spaces, I was able to really invest in the world and the characters and forget some of the gamey stuff, which is kind of cool.
No, that's
despite
awesome.
playing on the
that
hardest
definitely...
difficulty. So I don't know.
But no, you're right. Like,
yeah.
Yeah, but no, it shouldn't be minimized. You're right. We definitely, because we hadn't brought that up before, and that's definitely a huge difference between the versions. And they are really good accessibility features. So yeah, I have a friend who I'm dying for her to experience this game before the show comes out. And she struggled with it. She played on the easiest difficulty and she was still having trouble, mostly because she would kind of just panic in situations and use all of her resources and then kind of feel screwed. And she just wasn't having fun with it. There's an accessibility feature where you have like unlimited ammo, like, and stuff. And that's just like, I personally wouldn't want to play on that, but also I know people like my friend who would. Like, that's incredibly accessible, like, and allows somebody who maybe was struggling with the game to still play it. That's awesome.
It's so cool.
It is. It's excellent.
No, because there are things that are basically situational disabilities, right? Like if you have a kid, it would be disabling if you cannot pause a game. Something like Elden Ring or whatever. The fact that you can't pause it if you have a kid who's running across your living room and you have to help him or some shit, that counts as a situational disability. There's also disabilities that pertain to like, oh, I injured myself and right now I can't use this hand properly. It's like, sorry, I'll go off on this rant elsewhere.
That's a really good explanation.
And the thing is, it's expensive to do and no one thanks you for it.
Right.
And it's the, if you're a smaller studio, it's the thing you can't afford to do. And so I guess when we talk about, Naughty Dog throwing money at you every frame of this game, it's also nice to see that there's money being spent in other places where it matters. And when we talk about like, okay, this is a $70 game or whatever it is in the US, there's a lot of things that have been added to. It's not just, there's new graphics. This is a modern game with the things that come with that. It's a modern AAA game and the things that come with that. And so I just didn't want to like go through this discussion without noting that at least, because I do think it's important. And whenever I buy a new game now, I go through and I check and I see what's available, because I discover stuff like auto pickup or there's a feature in God of War Ragnarok, which if you're playing, you should turn on, which is if you click in the left stick, Kratos will turn and face whatever your currently tagged objective is. Sounds small, but if you're playing without the compass on and you're in like a big level and you're like, I don't have to check the map again, but I'm pretty sure I'm going the right way, click that stick and he'll just go boop. And it's so small, but it makes such a difference because it just lets you stay in the flow of things. Yeah, little stuff like that.
That's cool.
Yeah. So, but yeah, to your point about Bill, I think it's just because that area in particular looked pretty good to start with. It's fairly standard suburbia. It's all brick and masonry, and it just like it looks like a set from The Walking Dead, kind of, and it still looks like that. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Right. And Bill obviously looks a little different, but I mean I like his newer look. Obviously, like in general, I would say I like all the new looks now. Like they're like the definitive versions to me. I never found Bill's original model to be none of them are bad, but like there were some that like annoyed me a little more than others. Particularly Henry's model always bothered me. I don't know why, so I like his model a lot better in this version. But that said, yeah, Bill looks good, and you know, it's not that different, but it's, you know, there are little noticeable things.
Okay, so Joel and Ellie continue their journey to find Tommy. They talk about Joel's relationship with his brother, and you know, Joel kind of hedges and admits like, hey, we didn't leave on great terms last time we caught up with each other. And they come upon a closed gate to a dam, guarded by several armed people. As the kind of a woman comes out and interrogates Joel and Ellie, Tommy recognizes Joel and opens the gates. He introduces the woman as his wife Maria, and they all head inside. Within, Maria brings Ellie to get some food, and Tommy gives Joel a tour of the plant. Once they're alone, Joel tells Tommy about Ellie and her unique condition. Joel proposes that Tommy finishes the job and collects payment from Marlene. Tommy refuses, and the two begin to argue, but it's cut short as a pack of bandits show up and attack the settlement. Joel and Tommy fight their way back to Maria and Ellie, and upon seeing his brother's apparent love for Ellie, Tommy makes up his mind and decides to help deliver Ellie to the Fireflies. He discusses it with Maria, who is distraught and against the idea. Ellie listens in and picks up that Joel is going to be handing her off to Tommy. Upset by this, she steals a horse and takes off into the woods alone. When Joel and Tommy learn of Ellie's disappearance, they each grab a horse and look for her together. After handling more bandits, they find her in an abandoned ranch house, where Ellie accuses Joel of planning to leave her with Tommy, and that he wanted to get rid of her the whole while. He argues that she would be safer with Tommy, and Ellie brings up Sarah, saying how she isn't her. This greatly upsets Joel and prompts him to say, "You're not my daughter, and I sure as hell ain't your dad, and we are going our separate ways." Ugh. Before Ellie can respond, Tommy bursts into the room and tells them that bandits have invaded the house. They fight their way out, and Joel and Ellie head off toward Colorado alone. Yeah, that scene is the clarity of the facial expressions. Oh my god. The way that like this like Ellie is so like upset that she's angry, and Joel is so angry that he's upset, and it's just like, oh, it's it's just agony. It feels like being a teenager again and just having an argument with your parent, and like nobody wins in that scenario. Oh, it's sensational.
There's so much going on in their facial expressions, and again, like this was the same in the original, but like it's just enhanced in this version. Like looking into the nuances of the way they look at each other, and like the voice acting and the dialogue. Like this scene is a masterclass. Like I don't feel hyperbolic in saying it might be one of my favorites of all time in gaming. Like it's so good.
It's so good.
It says so much.
Oh, the acting is just. There's a moment where Ellie's like, you know, you never wanted. She says something like, "You never wanted me," or "You're always trying to get rid of me." And Troy Baker looks at her, looks away, is about to say something, looks back, and then says something else. And you see it all happen in like a split second, this micro expression, like a split second. And it's like, and you just, you feel the turmoil, like you feel just all of these gears turning. And then when she brings up Sarah, the look on Joel's face, like he just, he complete, like his entire, there's like this shock that runs through his entire body. It's just, God, it's so good. I'm probably just going to play the whole scene because it's so good.
You should.
Is this really all they had to worry about? Boys? Movies? deciding which shirt goes with which skirt. It's bizarre.
Get up. We're leaving.
And if I say no?
Do you even realize what your life means? Huh? Running off like that, putting yourself at risk? It's pretty goddamn stupid.
Well, I guess we're both disappointed with each other then.
What do you want from me?
Admit that you wanted to get rid of me the whole time.
Tommy knows this area
Oh,
better
fuck
than...
that.
Well, I'm sorry. I trust him better than I trust myself.
Stop with the bullshit. What are you so afraid of? That I'm gonna end up like Sam? I can't get infected. I can take care of myself.
How many close calls have we had?
Well, we seem to be doing all right so far.
And now you'll be doing even better with Tommy.
Not her, you know.
What?
Maria told me about Sarah.
Ellie?
And
You are treading on some mighty thin ice here.
I'm sorry about your daughter, Joel. But I have lost people too.
You have no idea what loss is.
Everyone I have cared for has either died or left me. Everyone fucking except for you. So don't tell me that I would be safer with someone else, because the truth is I would just be more scared.
You're right. You're not my daughter. And I sure as hell ain't your dad. We are going our separate ways.
Get it together. We're not alone.
There are two walking in.
Talk about acting, like Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I think this is the scene that sort of got me. I was on board for Joel's new look like earlier than this, obviously, but this scene sort of made me be like, wow, I see the anger on Joel's face. It's not just like kind of the default look. Like you can see when his face changes. And this defensiveness that he has when Ellie brings up Sarah, and just how guarded he is still. It's so good.
And this is part of what I really like about this version of Joel that they get to render, is that like he's not a good guy. Like he's supposed to be the adult here, and he just completely flies off the handle in a way that is like, yeah, you're not her dad because you'd be a terrible father. And you probably weren't a great dad, if we're being fucking honest. And you really get to see like also what I like is Tommy seeing the way that Joel treats Ellie, and Tommy realizing before Joel does that he is treating her like Sarah. And everybody knowing that except Joel is such good storytelling here, because when you have that moment where she says, "I'm not Sarah," you suddenly go, "Oh, Joel didn't even realize he was doing this." Like he's been so caught up in like this reluctance to be involved in this, and he's been so caught up in oh well, Tommy will be best off for her. He's been so caught up in what's best for her. He hasn't stopped to ask himself how he's treating her. And it's such a cool, what a complicated and brilliant storytelling maneuver that, as you say, just comes to a crescendo in this absolutely brilliant scene. It's talk about like all of your elements working together, your story, your sound design, your music, your set design, your visuals, your graphics, your acting, your voice acting, all of that comes together in this scene in a way that is stunning. And it's almost a shame. I thought about this when I was playing it. It's almost a shame that it doesn't hard cut from that to them on the road to Colorado. I think that little bit of combat and then the little bit with Tommy afterwards, not that it's bad, but I think it would have been a much more striking decision to hard cut and to have us wonder what the resolution was and have to unpack that as we went through. Not to try and rewrite one of the best sequences in video games, but like I was thinking that this time.
It
just, the combat felt so, I just didn't want to do it. I was like, oh no, like I I wanted to sit in that for a bit longer. I was still processing.
Yeah, there's spoilers for the movie Steel Magnolias, but I'm bringing it up for a reason, I promise. I just watched the movie for the first time, and have you seen this movie?
No.
Okay, so in the scene, I won't go too in depth, but Sally Field's daughter passes away, and there's this moment at the end of the movie where her friends are Sally Field's like just so upset, and she's like just yelling and just saying like, why did her daughter have to die and be taken away from her? And then one of the friends like says something that's like sort of comedic to try to like not remove her grief, but sort of make a little light of it, to try to like say, I'm with you, but I'm also like gonna try to like get you through this. And it's not a bad scene, but what it does that I felt was kind of jarring was that it took me out of the grief too quickly.
Yeah.
I wanted to sit with it a bit more. And I'd say, going back to your point, that I think the combat segment after the scene it doesn't necessarily take you out of the scene. Like, it's still expertly done, but I do agree that like it almost feels like I don't want to be here doing this. I want to sit with this a bit longer.
Yeah. Which is
again,
a testament.
Like,
that's a testament to how good it is, right? Like, that's not a criticism. That's just like this scene is so affecting that I wanted to be in it more, or I wanted to stay with it more. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, it's not a criticism. It's just an observation.
Right. Yeah, because it's not that I mean, I do agree with you. It's not that I dislike it. It's just, it just kind of takes you out of it, but still very good.
Yeah. God damn. You ever just think about being Neil Druckmann and like writing that in your script, and like for all of my foibles and issues with the guy, god damn if he doesn't sometimes strike gold.
That's what I mean. Like, this game, like, when I tell people like I love this game, like I don't say that lightly. Like, this scene alone, like, this is sort of what elevates The Last of Us in terms of narrative from other games. Because, like, combat-wise, like, I don't think it's that, like, it's that standout. I mean, we can have, like, discussions about that, but I don't think it's, like, that, like, out of the norm, or it just feels like a video game. It's fine. It works really well. But, like, the story, for me, is what sets this game apart from most stories being told in games.
Yeah, definitely.
And this just, it's so good. Like,
I mean, the closest game I can think of well, I mean, I would argue probably just surpasses it is probably Red Dead Redemption 2. That has probably the best story in a video game. It's able to do things that no other game or story has ever really been able to do, I don't think. It does things like there are characters in that game who, there's a character in particular, Micah, who anyone who's played the game knows what I'm going to say, which is that game has an ability to make you hate a person. It makes you hate somebody so like you know them, like they're a real person. This video game character, you hate them like they're someone you know. And it does it so brilliantly, and you love these characters and you have these complicated feelings for them. And I think it takes a lot of what the original Red Dead Redemption did, a lot of what The Last of Us did, and it really takes a lot of that and elevates it. There are lots of things in that game that are kind of complicated and hard to sort of pick apart from the gameplay, but certainly the story, I would say. Last of Us is up there. I'd say, like, definitely top 3. It is very contained, and for that reason, I think compared to Red Dead, which is like, an 80-hour, 100-hour experience, this is very contained. This feels like a film. And yeah, it's just, I mean, scenes like this, like, are you kidding me? Like, this is, you could play this for somebody who doesn't play video games, and they'd be like, holy shit, this is like art right here. Like, this is something. This really definitely surpasses the medium in what it's able to do.
Yeah, for sure.
Turns out if you have all the money and time in the world, you can do pretty cool stuff in games. Who knew?
Which, Naughty Dog, they're doing well with that. Which good for them.
Good for them. Okay, so Colorado. Together, Ellie and Joel head for the University of Eastern Colorado. As they search the school buildings for the lab, it becomes increasingly obvious the school's been abandoned. They finally find a recorder that tells them of the current whereabouts of the Fireflies, and they are spotted by another group of survivors that attack. As they try and escape, Joel is pushed over a railing by one of the attackers. He falls down 2 stories and is impaled through the stomach on a metal piece of rebar, which leaves him wounded and struggling to walk. Ellie helps drag him onto the horse, and they escape the hunters. They ride away from the school, and then we do a cut to the winter. I don't really have a lot of notes here. I mean, the school is still very... it's so weird just a university being empty like this. It's very eerie and strange, and to your point earlier, I definitely had that feeling of like the dread kind of creeping back in, where I was like, oh, this isn't natural. I don't know if I like this. Yeah, it's really good.
It looks good, and honestly, like, a general note, like, this is probably my favorite segment of the game. I love the university so much. Just like, I love the aesthetics of autumn and just being at this empty university and sort of the weight of that, like you were saying. And I love the little bits of storytelling that happen as you go through, if you do explore the whole university, because much of the university, like, this could be a really short segment if you wanted it to be, if you decided not to explore. But if you like pick up the notes and stuff, I love reading about the students and how they're, waiting. Yeah.
It's so interesting. You go through all the dorm rooms and you find out how they're all dealing with it differently, and it's really cool.
I love it, and I will say I love my this is just a general critique. My only, I think, critique of like the story in this game is when Joel gets impaled. I don't know how he survives this, man. I still
crazy. He falls down 2 stories, and that rebar just bam, like it's and the way that he falls and it like he hits the ground and you can see him. He tries to because if you ever like fall on your back, you immediately like recoil because you try and straighten your back, and as he does that, you see the rebar pull it, and you're like, like it's so visceral, and I'm like, like it's so full on.
Or like when Ellie pulls him up too, I'm like, I can't look.
Oh my god. I'm like, this guy just for sure should be dead. Like,
it's. Yeah.
I mean, he nearly does die, to be fair.
That's true. He does nearly die. That is a hard segment to watch. That's a scene where I did look away from. I normally didn't look away from on the original. This one, I was like, no, I'm looking away. And as a fun fact, I always look away if I die in the game. I don't want to see Joel getting mauled by an infected. I've never actually watched the animation. I always look away.
I remember when I first played the original Dead Space, and the first time a character got, I was just like, what happened? It's just like Isaac getting like ripped in half, and you watch and you're like, oh my god. Yeah, this game is it's pretty visceral with that stuff. Because I died a lot in this game. Playing it on hard, it was like I died an awful, because I'm also bad at games is the other thing. If you don't know my history of video games, I'm not good at them, and I'm even worse at shooters, so I don't know what I was thinking.
I'm bad at shooters,
but it was that scene's brutal. I mean, I guess they're trying to communicate like he's not walking away from this, right? Like this is not just a bad injury, this is like he's gonna die if he doesn't get help.
Right. No, I was just gonna say this is an example where they do a hard cut, but of course that kind of leads into the DLC explanation of what happens. But if we didn't have the DLC giving us that explanation, I think we'd still be fine, honestly. It's still like there's an element of sort of agree to disagree, of just sort of like, yeah, I'll believe it, but like I don't think he would have survived. But like, that's a nitpick.
Yeah, I think
we didn't
narrative,
need the DLC to,
narratively it works because it puts Ellie by herself dealing with David and the cannibals. Like, and that's really what needs to happen here is we need to see her, we need to see her come to reality with the world without Joel. We need to see her confront that, and that achieves that as a narrative utility. So for me, it strains believability, but like. Also, whatever, it's a story. Like, this shit happens in stories, you know?
Exactly. Yeah.
Out hunting in the snow. So Ellie's by herself, basically. She's out hunting. She's approached by two men, David and James, who offer to trade supplies in exchange for a deer she's killed. Ellie is very cautious and asks them for antibiotics, and James heads off to retrieve it, while David remains. David tries to befriend Ellie, but she is skeptical of his good nature, and basically tells him nothing. He takes his rifle, and before long they hear infected approaching. They then work together to fight them off. When they're safe from the infected, David reveals the group of men who attacked her and Joel at the university were part of his group. Sensing she's in trouble, Ellie reaches for a gun but finds she's outnumbered as James returns. David tells James to let her go and give her the medicine, which he does. Ellie flees with Callus back to the garage of an abandoned house where Joel is resting. He's still weak and incredibly ill. She gives him the antibiotics and falls asleep. When she wakes up, she discovers that David's group has tracked her down, and she has no choice but to leave Joel as she attempts to draw them away. She takes off on Callus, who is shot very quickly as the men chase her. Ellie escapes on foot and avoids them for the most part, but David does eventually catch up with her and knocks her unconscious. She wakes in a cage, and the first thing she sees is James butchering a human body. David approaches her and once again attempts to get on her good side, claiming he can convince the others to keep her alive. Ellie still does not trust him and breaks his finger in an attempt to grab the keys to the cage. He grabs her arm and slaps her against the door of the cage. Finally, out of patience and temper, David leaves the room and threatens to have her cut up into little pieces. Meanwhile, Joel finally wakes up and notices Ellie's absence. He goes desperately looking for her, kills the rest of the men that had tracked Ellie back to the house. He captures two and tortures them until they give up the location of the resort, and then kills both of them and sets out looking for Ellie. I mean, look, the snow looks as good as it's ever looked. Looks like real snow. Credit where it's due.
It does.
It also looks cold. I know it seems like a dumb thing to say, but it looks cold, and that's a hard thing to kind of do in any kind of video game, I think.
I agree, because when I was playing it, I physically felt like freezing while I was playing it. So like actually playing through it, I remember like thinking distinctly like, oh my god, I feel colder looking at this. That's how cold it felt. Like
it's really
awesome.
compelling. Yeah. I also like the way that, like, as you move around and stuff like that, the snow's clump into things, and you get all the nice sort of particle simulations that you want.
Yeah, again, my obsession with footprints. I was looking at the footprints in the snow, and I'm like, wow, it really tracks them. This is great.
Do you remember I was trying to remember the first game that did that, and I think for me it was Assassin's Creed 3. It was like one of the very first E3 trailers they did, and it's like Connor's like walking through the snow, and he's like, it's deep snow, so he's kind of lifting his knees, and it's leaving like the kind of shape behind him. And I was like, whoa, video games never gonna look better than this.
Yeah. God, I can't even remember, honestly. One in particular, but yeah, it's always incredible, like seeing stuff like that. And this, you're right. The way like when they're walking through the snow, you can see like not just like footprints, but like tracks, like sort of tracking through the snow rather than just footsteps, I guess. Yeah. It looked very good.
Yeah, I actually tracked the deer. Like I tracked the deer based on its tracks. I didn't use to look at the blood. Like I was able to actually just follow it. And I was like, whoa, that's crazy. Video games are good, actually.
Did you know?
Did you know?
They're awesome.
I'm trying to think if I wrote anything else down here. David's performance is creepy and bizarre, and I also love all of the things Ellie does in his presence. She's just such an asshole, and I'm here for it. Like for no reason. She just senses the vibes are off. She's like, the vibes are off. I'm not having any of this.
Yeah,
it's good.
I will say that Winter, I also really love a lot. It's like a very close second to the university section. Ellie is really squishy when you play as her. She will die really quickly and it becomes extremely frustrating. So that's probably the only reason I kind of knock it down a peg. But I love playing as her. I love getting a new taste of combat and like seeing, I guess, the world from her perspective, and like getting to shoot the bow with her is awesome.
Yeah.
And the way like David will like throw you some ammo and you quickly pick it up, like it's a very fast-paced segment, which I love.
Yeah.
If you're really good at it, you can go through it really quickly.
I am not. I was
not
dying
either.
every
I died
like
a lot.
5 or 6 steps. It reminds me a lot actually of the and not just because they're in winter, but gameplay wise, it's very similar to the ski lift segment in The Last of Us Part 2 at the start with Abby, where Joel and Tommy, you're sort of defending them as they try and like shift this cart so you can escape. It's very similar in that sense, just gameplay wise. We're in a closed space, then you get into like a weird shaped area and you've got infected crawling in at different places. It's like almost identical gameplay wise, and they both work really well. But yeah, I got the shit kicked out of me in this segment repeatedly. It's
rough.
Yeah. And it does convey that sense of like Ellie is really scraping by. Like she's not Joel and she's not there yet. And this is really, she's on the ropes the whole time.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, because you don't have, I mean, you have a lot of the same like weapons if you pick them up, but like you really like the infected will catch you. It's very difficult. Like just in the one segment where the bloater drops down, before that when the infected are, like crawling through the windows and stuff, you know, there's tons of resources around, but it's more just kind of running up to them and finding them, and then also making like being aware of your surroundings, and like if you miss a beat you will die. Like it's so tight, and that's kind of why I love it and also why I get so frustrated with it. But I love the David stuff, and I love sort of, I guess, just having Ellie more of more of a protagonist role, not that she wasn't, but being able to play as her definitely changes the perspective, I guess, of the game.
And you can definitely feel her. You can feel the adult she's going to become as well in a really interesting way. Where you can feel that like this like snarky, sarcastic thing isn't her just being a teenager. This is who she is.
Right.
And you can kind of see that in really interesting ways. Speaking of frustrating, I want to talk about the next little sequence here because oh my god. That boss fight on Ungrounded is fucking impossible. So okay, just to set this up, James wakes up Ellie and basically takes her to the butcher's table with David. Ellie fights back against them. She ends up biting David. Before he can throw a butcher knife, she reveals she's infected. And then she takes the butcher's knife and buries it into James's neck, just escaping as David shoots at her. She basically tries to find a way out and ends up in a restaurant where David has her trapped. The restaurant catches on fire as Ellie sneaks around trying to get David with a switchblade. They fight and are both eventually knocked out in the struggle. Outside, Joel arrives at the resort and is scouring the area. He soon notices the restaurant and attempts to head inside to investigate. Within, Ellie regains her consciousness and spots David's machete. As she attempts to retrieve it, David wakes up. He kicks her several times and pins her to the ground, not knowing the machete is just within reach. He threatens her, and then Ellie finally grabs a hold of the machete and hacks David to death with it. Joel eventually makes his way inside and takes the weapon from her. She's clearly freaked out and literally cannot control herself. Joel brings her back to her senses and she sobs in his arms as he reassures her. The two leave and the camera pans down toward the bloody handle of the machete, which is still buried in David's face. This fucking boss fight took me 2 hours. I
believe it.
I've played this game 8 or 9 times. I understand the mechanics of this boss fight. I don't know what it was about what they've done to it on Grounded. Maybe it's because the way that like listen mode is slightly different. I don't know what it is, but this was fucking impossible. Like I had to YouTube somebody. I had to watch someone do it on Grounded, and then be like, okay, what are they doing that I'm not doing? And it was nothing. They were doing the same thing. They just got lucky. Like they just got lucky with his pathing. It was so frustrating. Like it's the one time where I was like, oh, this isn't fun. I'm not having fun. This isn't scary. This is just frustrating.
Yeah, I do not envy you in playing Ungrounded with this boss fight because I don't think it's fun on the normal difficulty I played on. I mean, I was actually confused when I started playing it because I played this game, I think, 4 times before playing part 1. And I distinctly remember there being bottles everywhere around. And what you would do is you'd pick one up and throw it at David to stun him. And then you'd be able to have an opportunity. I know you can sneak around, but I distinctly remember the bottles. There was nothing in there at all. And I was so confused because I was like, wait, what do you want me to do?
Yeah,
How am
what
I supposed to
do? Yeah, it's so...
like, you just...
It's like trial and error until you work out, like... But also the angle is really narrow of what it considers for you to be behind him. And I found that really frustrating. Where if he turned slightly... He'd get me, and I'm like, no, I was pressing the attack button. That's not fair.
Same. That would happen to me too.
It's not triangle; it's R1, or it's whatever the melee button is. So instead of when you sneak up behind someone normally and you try and strangle them, you have to hit him instead. And that kept fucking me up because I kept pressing triangle, like because that's normally what you do.
Right.
Oh, there's so many little things about this. It just like, it annoys me. Oh, it was so frustrating.
Yeah. It is, and it's hard, like, because too, like, they have in this distinct fight, because it's all about him listening to find where you are. So like they have glass all over.
Yeah, there's
and
also
if you step on it,
glass.
he's gonna come toward you. And also when he hides, like in the first phase, because there's 3 phases. The first phase, he's kind of just walking around, but as the fight goes on, he's hiding, and you just can't hear him because he's still, and like you have to wait for him to move, and it just is long. And I think it's hard on normal, so I once again do not envy you doing it on Grounded,
like
because I struggled. I'm sure.
I will say it did. So what I ended up doing is I ended up using I would get into a position where I knew I could route where he was, and then I would step on a piece of ceramic or glass, route somewhere, and I would use that to move him. Ooh. And that ended up being kind of the way that I ended up doing it. I think it needed bottles, or it needed something. Like, it just needed a bit more. I feel like you need more agency. I get thematically what this is trying to do, right? Like, you're outgunned, you're outmatched. You're not a physical match for this guy. You have to be stealthy. But it feels like they don't give you enough tools that it feels like you outthink him. It just feels like you get lucky, which is, again, sort of what they're going for. But it just isn't that enjoyable to necessarily play, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, yeah, I agree. And again, I do... I mean, maybe I'm misremembering, but like my memory was that at least on normal difficulty, there were bottles there. So I don't know why they removed them on normal mode, or if I'm misremembering, but like, again, I have played it like 4 times, like before playing this. So like, I don't think my memory's faulty, but I didn't look it up.
I genuinely
it felt harder.
Yeah.
But that was just another thing that stood out to me where I was like, oh, they slightly changed this in part 1. Like I was talking about with the bloaters earlier in the summer section. So yeah, still hard. There is something like kind of satisfying about it. But I think the satisfaction, and you can speak to this more than me, but I think some of the satisfaction comes from like doing it well in like kind of a quick manner. I think 2 hours, I'd be like you, I'd be like, this is not fun.
Yeah.
Like, this is not fun. Like, this is not satisfying. Like, you know.
Yeah.
Like,
it got to the point where like after I watched someone do it on YouTube, I was like, oh, okay, I understand how to do this fight. And then it just became about getting lucky, and that was kind of like, and yeah, it kind of lost some of the some of the appeal of what it's going for, which is it's supposed to be frantic and it's supposed to feel immediate. And I think that's sort of that's an unfortunate consequence of, I think, just game difficulty in general, is if the difficulty is just you take bigger hits and you do less damage, it can have some unfortunate consequences. I mean, obviously Grounded changes listen mode in really interesting ways, but it was the one time where I did consider changing the difficulty, but then I realized it wouldn't have made a huge amount of difference because the fight's still hard. So I was like, I'll just do it.
Yeah.
I made a point earlier about this, and I wanted to circle back to it, which is Joel captures and tortures these two dudes, and it is like I was alluding to earlier. It's not that he enjoys this; it's that he wants to do it, which is really interesting. Like he is a man who is changing fundamentally. Like he is sort of picking up some of the tools that he put down, and his performance here is really sensational. And yeah, you can really feel you can feel who this guy used to be really come to the surface, and you can feel this like intensity that is just, it's absolutely terrifying to watch. Like he is an absolute monster. Like Joel is a bad guy. He is a bad person who does bad things for selfish reasons, and then tells himself it's the right thing to do. And this moment was where I really had that confronting moment of like, of course he did what he did at the hospital. He's always been like this.
Right.
It's really the acting here and the facial expressions really bring that out, I think. And that's like what we said earlier about him being older and like more worn down. In this moment, you feel that it's not like fiery anger. It's like this dark kind of, it's like this nihilistic kind of streak of just brutality. And it's absolutely confronting to watch and to sort of be a willing participant in, even though you can't control these cutscenes. We talk about this a lot in the idea of like instrumental play versus like free play, but it's like you can't control this moment, but you can't turn the machine off and stop playing the game, right? Like you do have some control over being a willing kind of participant in this, and it's just, especially, and then you see Ellie and the way that she ends up killing David and what that does to her, and I suddenly had that sinking feeling of like, oh no, he's gonna make her like him. Like he is going to fully corrupt this person if someone else doesn't intervene. And it was a really like it's a really confronting few like little beats of story.
Yeah, it's interesting because I almost feel like I don't know a lot of behind the scenes behind this game apart from like stuff that you've told me and that we've talked about on and off the podcast, but I know it feels like Joel is almost an answer to like just violence, the general violence in video games. Like we have characters who are the protagonists and heroes who are doing awful things, but we're playing a video game, and so we're perpetuating this violence because that's what you do. And it almost feels like when I first played this game, I remember because I'd played Uncharted before, and I remember thinking like Joel just looked like Nathan Drake with a beard. I don't have that opinion anymore, but like at the time, because I didn't know the character, that was my thought. And a big critique with Nathan Drake is that he does these like abhorrent things, but like he's the hero, the nice guy, funny guy hero, where Joel feels like almost like a critique of that to a degree. Like you're doing horrible things, like, and he's not supposed to be a good person, and whether the player recognizes that or not is really, I guess, not the issue, but more just like what you take away from the narrative. And I appreciate that a lot.
There's that's actually really, that's really well said. There's I can't remember who wrote it. It was in one of the Bullet Point monthly essays about the Last of Us remake, and it might have been Yusukol or someone like that, who basically was like, Joel in The Last of Us, Joel is the man of the future in the sense of like he is able to survive and thrive. You know, he even ends up living in the large mansion in Jackson. He gets the daughter he always wanted, right? Like, you know, like if Joel is the future, and if the future is people like Joel, we're fucked. Like, humanity's fucked. And it's a really, like, and this is sort of what we talked about in The Last of Us Part 2. There's something deeply nihilistic about Druckmann's view of, not Druckmann's view, of the arguments his texts make about violence, and the modes of violence and those who conduct it. There's something sort of deeply personal in the text understanding of what drives people to violence, and a real, particularly in the second game, I think less so in this one, a real lack of understanding or lack of time spent on understanding systems of violence. Everything, we talked about this a lot in Last of Us Part 2, but it's present in these moments as well. Violence is always personal. It's always about two people and their relationship to each other. It's never about the systems and how they incite you to do violence. Even in the second game, where he's explicitly drawing parallels to the Western Bank and to the conflicts there, that game still cannot tease out the way that the Seraphites and the WLF are systematizing violence and using it for different means. It almost does it, and then it's like, oh no, actually Abby's motivation is Joel killed her dad. It's all personal. Abby's you know, like there's everything is personal. Nothing can be incited by a system. And these actors within these spaces, you know, Joel in these moments, Ellie in this moment, David in this moment, they are individuals capable of enacting violence on each other. And there's a line that David said, which I think is really telling, where he says, you have no idea what I'm capable of. And it's the sort of thing Joel wouldn't say because he doesn't need to threaten people. And there's something interesting happening there at you know, these things that echo with each other, where, you know, Joel we've watched him do things that are like unspeakably awful. By this point in the game, you've beaten people's skulls in with baseball bats. You've shotgunned people's faces to little bitty pieces. You've done abhorrent things to other humans. And yet, you know, in this sequence, it's the threat of violence that we find so disgusting. Whereas right before that, we've then watched Joel just enact terrible violence. And there's something about its ideas and the text kind of positioning these people of, we empathize and relate to Joel. And there's something about the way that his violence is positioned. It's like we were saying at the start with his character model and his age and all of these things, where it positions his violence as he's sort of an unwilling participant. Like, he's sort of reluctant to do it. This character of David is the guy who wants to do violence. He's like the villainous cannibal, and is therefore he's value negative. He's coded as being villainous, whereas we code Joel as perhaps not being heroic, but perhaps being perhaps his violence having justification, or perhaps his violence being a necessary part of the new world, or survival, or something like that. And it's just interesting how these virtues are coded into these different actions. And it's not until the very end, or as you ramp up toward that conclusion, that you go, maybe Joel was the bad guy the whole time. And that's just really interesting, where they give you the villain, they give you the bad guy. He's a cannibal. Cannibals are bad. But maybe it's not that simple. Maybe Joel's a bad guy as well. I found that really. I always find that really interesting. I really like his inclusion here as the other version of the individual villain, I guess.
Yeah, like what do you do to survive in this world?
Yeah, because you don't really have, like, there's no like villain in this story. There's no like bad guy.
Right.
Well, I mean, there is, it's Joel, but like there's no structurally there's no antagonist, right? There's no Disney villain. There's no there's no Scar, there's no Macbeth to rebel against. Instead, the bad guy ends up being like Joel and his actions and what that ends up doing to the world in pursuit of this selfish thing that he wants. that we can empathize with, and that's the worst part about it. Is like, it's empathy for a monster, and I'm always surprised when people are like, "Oh, I don't understand The Last of Us Part 2. It's so it's like it's doing the same thing. Like it's the same maneuver. They just get to do it twice. You know.
Yeah.
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 Trying to think if I have any other notes on the resort. I don't think I do. What I quite like is when I went through the wiki to get the beats for this written out, everything is date stamped for some reason. So on April 28th, 2034, don't know how they know that. Joel spots the St. Mary's. Actually, okay, so apparently the reason they know this stuff is, you know how you get flashbacks to stuff in The Last of Us Part 2? Mm-hmm. Apparently there's ways to work out the date in The Last of Us Part 2, so they've like reverse engineered it for Part 1. Oh. Or something. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. Couldn't be me, but...
Yeah. Okay. I was going to say too, are there dates on like some of the journals that you find in the hospital?
Yeah,
maybe?
there might be.
Yes, maybe that's how.
Yeah.
I know I paid attention to the dates in some playthrough, but not this time. But yeah, that is interesting.
Yeah, I just thought it was notable that people have picked that up.
Yeah.
Nice. So Joel spots St. Mary's Hospital and points it out to Ellie, who seems distracted and distant. They make their way through a highway of abandoned cars and soon reach a bus station. Joel boosts Ellie up and she drops a ladder down, but sees something at a distance and hurries off. Joel follows as quickly as he can and discovers a group of giraffes have roamed into the deserted city, one of which was grazing on the vegetation around the building. The two pet the giraffe and then head up to the roof to marvel at the sight of the herd. They sort of have a moment here where... I really like this scene. They sort of have a moment here where they just sort of stand and watch the animals kind of go by, and the game just lets you stand there for as long as you want. As they turn to leave the building, Joel realizes they have the option to just leave, go back to Tommy's dam, and live out a simple life in Jackson. He brings this up, but Ellie is determined to reach the hospital and see their mission through, insisting that all of this can't be for nothing, and they set off with determination. Soon they reach an area with medical tents used during the initial outbreak. Joel recalls ending up somewhere similar during shortly after everything went wrong, and he saw broken families everywhere. For the first time, Ellie brings up Sarah without getting into a fight, and she offers him a photo of him and Sarah. Joel finally accepts that no matter how hard you try, you can't escape your past, and thanks Ellie for it. They make their way into an underground tunnel, much of which has been flooded and infested with the undead. They help each other through the debris, but soon reach an area with a loose platform. Joel falls off and into a broken bus where he becomes trapped. As Ellie breaks through the window to get him out, she's knocked into the water. Joel escapes and drags Ellie out of the water, who's now unconscious. As he frantically tries to resuscitate her, a Firefly patrol approaches and train their weapons on him, telling him to put his hands in the air. He ignores them, still in a state of panic, and is knocked out by one of the Fireflies. Look, I don't have a lot of notes on this particular sequence other than the holy good god, that section where you sort of go into the building, there's the giraffes and you're on that roof. I just stood there for like 10 minutes. I just literally panned the camera around and just the detail they're able to achieve and all of the pixels and the polygons and all the stuff they're piping through that PlayStation and just the serenity of that moment. I was absolutely it was breathtaking.
Yeah, it's really good. It's just the music is feels distinctly different from like most of the game. And it has like a much more I don't know, I was gonna say a quiet tone, which doesn't make too much sense, but just it has a sort of serenity to it, I guess, that feels very like sort of recognizing the awe of what you're experiencing, how there's so much destruction and yet there's life within it. It's a very nice scene, and you do just want to stand there and stare. And yeah, I love this scene a lot. It's really good.
Yeah, it's brilliant. I've noticed the these two games do that a lot, actually, where you'll come upon a vista right either after or before something really big is going to happen, and you'll sort of lean on a railing with the character, and the game won't prompt you to leave. You just leave when you're ready. They do it a few times in The Last of Us Part 2, and it always works well because you just sort of stand there with the person who you've been spending time with, and you just kind of like absorb this absolutely stunning vista. I think serenity is the right word. I was trying to think of another way to describe it. I think you hit the nail on the head. Like it is serene. It feels like the calm before the storm, where it's sort of like this last sort of moment of beauty and kind of serenity before things are going to get complicated. And you kind of know, you don't know things are going to go wrong. But you know that, potentially things are going to change. Like no matter what happens, things are going to change. This is kind of the last moment before the change happens. And it really does work really, really well. I like quiet moments like this in games a lot. They're hard to do well. There's a particular moment in Disco Elysium that I think is like the apotheosis of this kind of thing. For anyone who's played that, it's where you're sitting on the swing set with Kim and you're looking down at the crashed motor carriage, and the dialogue the game prints is something like, Kim starts whistling a tune, and you match him in a harmony. And the game says the dialogue is two birds on a wire whistling by the seaside, looking at the water and a sunken motor carriage.
As you sit down in the old rusty playground, the world around you becomes very silent. Nothing but the sound of seagulls high above in the sky, echoing like distant laughter. Ice cracks around the blue motor carriage in the sea. The tune on your lips forms a strange yet undeniably beautiful contrast with the surrounding bleakness. The lieutenant gives you a quick glance, then, still looking straight ahead, he joins you with a higher pitched and slightly more melodic trill. Two birds on a wire, whistling by the seaside, looking at the water and the sunken car. The wind blows. In the distance, behind the church, some vagrants are having an argument over a bag of tear they found in the reeds. Further away, a flock of seagulls lands. The clouds pass in the sky, and the shadow of the swing moves like the hour hand on a timepiece. 30 minutes have passed.
And you have this moment of just like pure, just like unadulterated, like it's just serenity and peace. And in a game filled with such violence, and with the violence that you're about to enact, it is a fascinating maneuver in a storytelling capacity. It is structurally the thing you do, by the way, like in a story, like, when you're about to go out of your fourth act, or you're about to like sort of get to the climax of your fourth act where everything goes wrong and the big thing, all the big explosions happen, usually have that moment of the calm before the storm. The classic one is in Lord of the Rings, where in that third film where it's Gandalf and it's Merry, and they're standing on the balcony and they're looking out at Khazad-dûm, and they talk about the afterlife and death, and Gandalf sort of like, hey, we can only do what we can do, and whatever waits for us beyond this isn't bad, it's just different, and there's beauty to be had still, as long as we keep fighting. And I think in this story, Ellie is really the kind of emotional core of the story, right? She's sort of the place or the character by which it rests a lot of its maneuvers on, I guess, when it comes to Joel, and the plot and the narrative and all of that stuff. And it's really quite similar to that scene we said before, where you have that big argument where it really just like, it takes all the air out of the room and you just really feel it. This is kind of the opposite, where it just completely fills the space and the screen and the story, and completely washes it with this just, you get a moment that I will remember that moment the first time I played that game for the rest of my life. Like it is, it's a moment that you're never going to forget. And it's an absolute treat to revisit it, and just see what they've been able to do with the all the triangles in the PS5. It's stunning.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it too, about how it just like fills the space like with the scene, versus like the other scene where like it does like sort of suck everything out of you almost, like it's just, yeah, it's a great way to put it. I think too there's like an intimacy to the scene that that is just very welcoming considering everything that they've been through. It's almost like being, like you said, the calm before the storm. We get a moment to reflect before we're about to hit a point where we know everything's going to change. The game has been building towards this, and it's the final moment to just be with Ellie, stand there with her, and not have any expectations, just sitting there watching the giraffes.
There's no dialogue. They just stand there. Yeah, it's
good.
Yeah, goddamn. It's, it takes a lot of restraint to pull off things like this. You can imagine in a different story, in a different game, they would force these characters to have dialogue here, or they would have some other interaction, or you would have like a quick time event, or there would be you would try and gamify or do something here to, like you could feel it's being overdone or overwritten or made too gamey, and they managed to kind of have the restraint to just let it be what it is, which I mean, yeah, hats off to them. This is a really affecting sequence. And, one thing we don't often talk about enough, I guess, is that a big component of any kind of storytelling is what you don't say as much as what you do say. And this is a game that really gets that right in a way that the second game just cannot. They really overshoot their shot in that second story. And this one, I really admire the restraint in moments like these.
I think that's a really good point. I think restraint is something that's incredibly undervalued a lot of times when it comes to story, because it's so easy. It's very easy to overwrite yourself, and knowing what to say, when to say it, is such a hard thing to do. And this game, that's another reason why I think I love it so much, is because I don't think there's any scene that I can think of that really doesn't do its job swiftly. Like, it does what it needs to do and nothing more, and it just works so well.
Nothing like overstays its welcome in that sense.
Right.
I think the closest it comes is some of the stuff with Bill, where Ellie and Bill clashing doesn't quite get there, but it almost overstays its welcome a little bit.
It's close. Yeah.
I mean, as we're sort of saying, like, I think it can be tricky. Like, killing your darlings is like a thing that you have to be disciplined in that way. And it's hard. It's really hard. I mean, that's the difference between like a piece of fiction that is really compelling and something that can end up reading like its own fan fiction. Me and Darth, we covered an episode of Sherlock a few months ago where the whole episode was just like indulgent, trite, and it literally felt like the writers doing their own fan fiction of their own show, because there was just no restraint. It was all just like all the stuff that people were doing on the Tumblr fan fictions, and it's like embarrassing to watch. You're like, you guys should know better. Like, this is, you have to be disciplined, and you can really tell that the screws are wired really tight, and it needs to be for them to pull off the maneuver they're about to pull off. So Joel wakes up in a hospital bed with Marlene at his side. She welcomes him to the Fireflies, and she says, we rescued Ellie, no problem. When he asks to see her, she reveals they're already prepping her for surgery, and it's a surgical process that will remove the mutated infection and reverse engineer a vaccine. The truth then dawns on Joel as he points out the infection grows all over the brain, meaning Ellie will have to die in order for them to extract it. He demands they find someone else. The tension grows in the room, and Marlene and Joel begin fighting about Ellie's fate. A Firefly knocks Joel to the ground. Marlene explains there's no other option and orders Ethan to march him out, even if he tries anything, to shoot him. As he's escorted out, Joel spots his backpack and belongings on a counter. He quickly attacks Ethan. He learns that Ellie is located in an operating room on the top floor before killing Ethan and quickly takes his things, heading to save her. As the gunshots are heard, he attracts the attention of other Fireflies, and all soon discover Joel has escaped and is on the loose. Joel fights his way to the operating room alone, where a surgeon and his 2 assistants stand around Ellie, who is not awake. As they back away, Joel approaches, but the doctor attempts to stop him from taking Ellie. The game makes you kill the doctor, and then Joel kills the other 2 assistants. Joel removes Ellie from the operating table and carries her out of the room as Fireflies close in on him. He runs through the first floor, trying to find a way out. He eventually manages to find an elevator just in time and heads down to the underground parking lot, where he is confronted by Marlene. With her gun trained on Joel, she makes a final attempt to change his mind, reasoning that Ellie would rather die for the vaccine than escape with him. Joel drives in silence for some time, and then after a while, Ellie stirs in the back. She asks him what happened, and Joel lies to her as he recalls the events that transpired in the parking lot. He shot Marlene, preventing her from coming after Ellie, but tells her the Fireflies have already stopped looking for a cure, and she is not the only human immune to CBI. Ellie turns away silently in disappointment, and Joel apologizes as he drives back to Tommy's dam. My goodness. Boy, this sequence.
Oh yeah.
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 Let me tell you, playing this one with the new graphics and the HDR, and my TV's like got a special game mode where it like does all the blacks properly. The way that this ended up working for me was like the darkness was really, really well detailed, and so the flashlights really popped, and it made this really intense game of cat and mouse even more intense as I was sort of really quickly running out of ammo dealing with all of this, trying to work through this sequence, and it just became so frantic. Like there was a point where I shot a guy, and then I whipped around, and this other guy sprinting at me, and I like bricked him in the face, and then someone else came. I was just like in this like complete state of panic the whole time. It's really full on. The only things I've really written down here, I mean, this scene these sequences are still really, really well put together. Marlene's facial expressions here, her voice acting is really, really comes to the forefront in that argument. Particularly when she's sort of saying like, Ellie's my daughter, like you don't have more of a claim to her than I do. The expressions working through her really interesting. I hadn't expected to be as compelled by that moment as I was. I really felt for her. I was like, yeah, she's right. Like Joel's just met her. She's like, I've raised this kid. Are you kidding me? You don't know what you're talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Marlene, like if you, again, this is totally optional, but if you do like sort of look around the hospital and pick up, the documents and voice recordings, you can see the sort of moral the place that Marlene is in, where she is very undecided about what she wants to do. She's so conflicted, but she's, even before Ellie gets there, she is just so at her wit's end, at the lowest point, and Ellie arriving is just this bittersweet thing, because on one hand it's like she doesn't want this child to die, but at the same time she knows that like this is the only chance they have for a cure. And again, I love those little bits of details that you don't need necessarily, but you can stumble upon if you sort of explore a little. And to your point too, her voice actress is just excellent. She does a really good job.
I think I wrote about that specific thing, the notes and the Fireflies and that sort of thing. I wrote about that in that issue of Level Story. And one of the things that really, really stood out to me is the Fireflies are falling apart when Joel are like, they're on their last legs, right? Like they are not, they're not going to survive. You're right. This is the last chance they have. This is not working. She is not a good leader of this thing. It's falling apart in front of her. And then her daughter arrives, and the only way that they can achieve what they've set out to, the only way for the Fireflies and their activities to be worthwhile is if she lets them kill her daughter. And that turmoil, and the determination she has in the face of Joel trying to push against her decision here, and her conviction is heartbreaking. If this is a talk about like really painting your characters into a corner, like talk about really writing them into holes they can't get out of without digging further. It's absolutely brilliant. Neither of these characters have any good choices here. It's an absolutely brilliant kind of final maneuver to place them in opposition to each other in this way, where you as the player feel an ownership over Ellie. You feel a connection to her because you have lived through Joel being the kind of guy who, when he has a daughter, feels like he owns them. You know, it kind of engenders you to his perspective of this conservative hard case who, you know, lives in the $30,000 millionaire mansion in the, you know, back and beyond of Texas. You empathize with him, and it's only as for me, I mean, you fight through the hospital, and that's really full on. But it's not until the game makes you shoot the doctor, it won't. The game stops. It will not go ahead until you pull that trigger. That was when I went the first time I played it. Anyway, we talked about it in our post-issue recording. The first time I played it, that was the moment where I went, "Oh no, I'm the bad guy." That was the moment for me where it really sunk in. Obviously, this time...
Yeah, for sure. And to your point, also, I will say, admittedly, that when I first played this game, I'm sure this reflects poorly on me, but I didn't think too much about it when I had to shoot the doctor. It was only after the game finished that I started, like, really thinking about it, because more thinking about Joel lying and then what came before that and sort of his decisions. That's when it kind of set in for me. Just kind of goes to show how sort of rhythmic a video game can become, where you're not really thinking about it sometimes. You're just enacting this violence that you're role-playing, and don't give it a second thought. And this game is literally begging you to give it a second thought at the end. And yeah, it's just, it's very impactful. Again, the sort of moral decision that you're faced with, either have Joel lose Ellie, this important, part of him that he's become attached to, or save humanity. I mean, we know the answer to this one, but it's also we can't help but also empathize with him. Like, nobody wants to lose someone, you know? That's something that's so difficult to go through. And to think about him having to go through it a second time, that's awful. But, you know, he then kills many people, including the only person who could find a cure for this, at least that we're aware of. And it's making a statement, whether you want to recognize it or not. But yeah, it's very good. It's just a great conclusion to everything that's happened, and it makes sense that Joel would do that. Like, it doesn't feel like you're being the hero, obviously. But it does feel like the end of a game. Like, it's a final conclusion. You're getting through all the enemies. You're doing the thing that you're supposed to do, and yet it's wrong. And I love the sort of the juxtaposition between those two things.
Yeah, it makes you complicit in doing the wrong thing through the, you know, instrumental play of the video game structure, right? The instrumental play of you have a backpack full of equipment, you have 10 rounds in your pistol, and the instrumental play of I need to work through this you know, cat and mouse style combat to work through this hospital. You're doing the instrumental play of the video game, and the game is making you do it and do the wrong thing. And like, that's really hard to pull off in games. I think, you know, there's a great paper about the original Mass Effect. It was where the original writers were reflecting on some of the things that happened, and they were like, you know, we have all these choices in the game. What we found is that, like, on collating all the data, like 93% or some absurdly high amount of percentage of players always chose the good guy decision because people want to be good. Like, they'll go back and they'll do the bad guy as a secondary playthrough, sure. But like for a lot of people, being a good guy is the canon option because people inherently don't want to be bad.
Right.
In some games that's actually incredibly hard. It's really, really hard to make Arthur Morgan an actual villain in Red Dead Redemption 2. He's not a good guy, but it's really hard to make him an actual villain. And I think it's really telling that, when you're playing it, and this is why we keep writing about these games and why we keep talking about it. And we don't have anything particularly new to say about the ending, I don't think, because I think there's been a lot of words written about it and a lot of hours spent of us talking about it as well. But I think it's really telling that even coming back to it now, it has the same impact each time. This isn't an ending that is lessened by knowing it's going to happen. It's something that me and Mitchie talked a lot about on the James Bond series that we did on A Method to the Madness, which you should definitely check out on whatever podcast platform you're on. We talked a lot about this idea of like, should we value things because they have rewatchability or replayability, or should it be about the merit of the thing by itself? And this game kind of gets to have it both ways, where it has great replayability because every time you play it, it manages to pull off the same maneuvers, but then also it works really well the first time. And each time you revisit it, you get a little bit more out of it. And that to me is like, it's not just a good story, it's like a great work of art in that sense, because it is able to achieve that. It's not achieving anything new narratively, which is what I was alluding to before, but it's able to achieve things in it, like, because it has that advantage of being a game and that instrumental play, it's able to achieve things differently than a book. A book cannot achieve things in the same way. And there are things that this game can't achieve because it's not a book. And so it's just recognizing the strengths of the medium. And how well these guys get it in this game. How well you can tell all of the people involved, Straley, Druckmann, all of his contemporaries, you can tell they're all firing on all cylinders, and they perfectly understand what a narrative game can do. And this revision that they've put in place here crystallizes that and is just is really something spectacular. By the time I got to this point, I'd stopped noticing that it was a remake at all, and I was just fully in the story again.
Same.
After the giraffes, which I was just so stunned by how detailed the city was, I was just fully in the story. Like every muscular maneuver of Marlene's face, every twitch of Joel's, lip or whatever, I was just like, I was in the story. I was like, this is really happening. I can't believe. And this game does that thing which I like, which is the same thing. I'm trying to think, what's the other film that's in Revenge of the Sith, which is say what you all about the prequels. Every time Anakin walks up to Mace Windu and Palpatine, where they're on the window, every single time I'm convinced by Hayden Christensen's performance that he might choose differently. Every single time he acts that scene so well that as he walks up, I'm like, maybe this time he won't side with Palpatine, and he never does. And this scene very much feels that way, where as Ethan's walking Joel out, I'm like, maybe this time he'll make the right choice, and he never does. And that's the sign of a really good story. Hot damn, The Last of Us. I guess to games good. To summarize, I guess the ending here, and then we'll get out of here. So. Back in Jackson County, Joel is looking under the hood of their vehicle, and Ellie, who's kind of still dejected, is obviously thinking about their trip to the lab. Joel explains they'll have to walk, and they continue their way toward Jackson on foot. On the way there, Ellie stops Joel and confronts him about his version of events that transpired. She expresses more or less her survivor's guilt, mentioning all of her friends who have died and succumbed to CBI, and wonders if she could have done more to end the pandemic. She asks Joel to swear to her that everything he told her about the Fireflies is true, and he does. She kind of hesitantly accepts his answer, and then we cut to credits.
Ellie.
Her name was Riley, and she was the first to die. And then it was Tess. And then Sam.
None of that is on you.
You don't understand.
I struggled
for a long time with surviving. And you, no matter what, you keep finding something to fight for. Now, I know that's not what you want to hear right now.
Swear
but
to
it's-
me. Swear to me that everything that you said about the Fireflies is true.
I swear.
Okay.
We talked a lot about the ambiguity of this ending last time we sat down to talk about this. And I was needlessly contrarian to start a conversation with the kind of larger group about whether or not this ambiguous ending, you know, for all the praise we heap on it, is this a cop-out or is it, what's the maneuver here? Obviously, I love the ending and I just thought that was a really interesting conversation to have. This time around, I was surprised by, because I've been playing the game with this kind of knot in my chest the whole time, with this kind of sense of this dread. I found it a lot more, depressing is the wrong word, but I found it a lot grimmer of an ending, because it, like, as it cut, I suddenly had that realization of like, oh, the world's screwed forever now. Like, nothing can go back to the way it was now. It's not just about Ellie, like, and not just about the fact that Joel's a monster. Like, all of that stuff that I was scared about, what if there was no repairing it? Like, what if this is it? This is it now. This is it now. And that's one of the scariest realizations about it's like season 5 of The Walking Dead or something, where you realize that there's no cure for the undead, and it just, like, you suddenly go, oh, like, this reality is paper, like, the reality of society is paper thin, and putting it back together is impossible. And this is a moment of, like, you realize that Joel has truly doomed the world, and has betrayed the one person he cares about.
Yeah, it's interesting how I love when a story can take sort of have like the more personal implications and then also speak to broader implications of like the choices that characters are making. Like, this is a very deeply personal story between Ellie and Joel, and so this final scene, like, the impact that I think it does its job in giving us the impact of sort of Joel's lie, and like one of my favorite lines of the game, which is just Ellie saying okay and cutting to black. Like, I love her facial expressions and just the sort of implications that are like you can just read from her face, and just her saying okay and accepting that, and the ambiguity of it. But also, like you said, the world is doomed because of this. Like, there is no escaping that reality, and like literally, like just this is. And
but like it's the story and the plot coalesce, right? Like, the world is doomed, but so is Joel. Joel is you know, they often say that in tragedies, you know, the biggest risk is not death, the biggest risk is damnation. And Joel is damned by this action, forever damned by this action. He cannot come back. There is no way back from this decision for Joel Miller. Joel has basically, he's doomed his soul, is what he's done. He's made this split-second decision and doomed himself, and Ellie and the world. And these things sort of, they interlink. And that, like you say, when she says okay, and the way she says it, and then it cuts, and it's like, yeah, it just it all comes together so brilliantly.
It's Shakespearean.
It is. It really is.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Man. It's very good. And like you kind of said as well, I have nothing. The more we've gone into this conversation, the more it's kind of veered from like what we've noticed to sort of just analyzing the story as a whole. Like, because I have nothing more to say other than like it looked damn good.
But maybe that's the trick of this remake, right? Is that the opening sequences, you start to notice those things because they're different, and then they all start to work together. Like the story just starts to work even better than it ever has, and it stops becoming about the graphics and the triangles and the whatever, and it just you get swallowed by the story, and it's even more involving, and it's even more detailed, and you have that argument, and then you have the giraffes, and then you're suddenly, and then it's the hospital, and you're like, oh my god, and then it's over, and then you just sit there in this scale of it, and you just I sat there, I watched the whole credits. I try and do this with every game now. I try and watch the whole credits, and I just sat there, and like the aftermath of that is so brilliant. There's something really unfortunate I think we've lost in media in general, which is all these streaming services will skip credits and go to the next thing. One of the things I love is a streaming service I use doesn't do that. And I've been rewatching Mad Men recently, which is still the best TV show of all time. And there are endings of that show where it will sort of fade to credits and then a song will play for like 3 minutes. And if you skip that and start the next episode, you miss so much of the downtime required to process what happened and to come to terms with what happened. And this, for me, like sitting in just the absolute grimness of this and the like, the processing through those different thoughts that I was articulating before. I mean, it is a thing to behold. Finishing this game is an experience. And I can't stress enough how that experience of playing it, of walking through all these spaces, really taking my time, the franticness that the grounded mode engendered. This felt like a really, idealized is the wrong word. This felt like the definitive experience of this story for me this time around.
I agree. And that's a statement that I did not think I would be making about this, to be honest. Again, like I mentioned going into this, I was sort of like a porcupine. I got my spikes out, little needles out, and I warmed up to it pretty quickly, and it truly does feel like the definitive version. In fact, I still haven't bought it, but once it goes on sale, and it's a bit cheaper. I mean, it is kind of on sale now, but I'll probably buy it when it's a little cheaper. But I do plan to pick it up because, like, I don't know if I can go back to playing the original. Like, just knowing that we have this version, it does feel like the definitive version. It just enhances everything I loved about the game and makes it better in small ways, but if you love the game, noticeable ways. And I really appreciate that.
Definitely. It's it's a real achievement. I think it's difficult when we talk about this stuff because price tag wise, this is a very expensive game. I certainly wouldn't have purchased it. I wouldn't have purchased it for the amount of money it is, but I also don't really value games for that reason either. I'm not sort of someone that goes like, is it, how much value am I getting out of like $10 when I spend on a game, whatever. That's just never been a passing concern for me. And, I'm financially stable enough now that like I probably could have afforded to buy it. I just looked at the price tag and I was like, I probably wouldn't buy that. But I think if this is a story that has mattered to you previously and you've played the second game and probably had a similar experience to a lot of people where maybe that might have been a bit disheartening or you might have kind of become a bit cold on it, I really recommend experiencing this in the form it's in at the moment. Really take your time with it, really soak it in. Playing it on the new hardware and with all the full setup and stuff. Really, I'm not a big graphics guy. I'm not even a big like resolution guy, but being able to, which is why I play on the PlayStation because it deals with all that for me. I just pick the mode of the graphics and it does all the stuff and it's got all the smart stuff with the HDMI 2, so the TV does all the hyperdynamic resolution scaling, all that shit, whatever. I don't understand any of it. It deals with it all for me. But the experiencing this in its format as it is currently, I think is I can't recommend it enough, and it is a piece of art that I'm sure we will end up talking about again, probably when the TV show comes out. But because it is that affecting, and each time we talk about it, each time we play it, we get something different from it. And you know, I think that's a real sign of a really valuable cultural artifact. And I appreciate that this exists. And as much as I have different criticisms and critiques and ideas around things it's doing or things it's not doing, the fact that it exists and we're able to synthesize a lot of interesting conversations and value and generate new ideas from it is a real testament to the work that these guys put into it, the work these teams put into it, the accessibility features that are going to make this an experience for people that will have never been able to play it before is really exciting to me as well. So all in all, I think it's great this exists. Yes, the price is prohibitive, but for what it is as a piece of art, I think it's an absolute masterclass. What an achievement. Hats off to everybody involved. Really just spectacular.
Yeah, and I'll echo your sentiments. I don't have much new to say beyond that. I think you said it perfectly. If I had the only different thing to say, which again, you pretty much said, but I do think it's a little overpriced, but for being almost a shot-for-shot remake, I mean, the stuff they do, I think, is incredible. So I don't think it justifies it. It's still a little expensive to me, but I love this game a lot, and I think after playing it now, I see the care they put into it, and I just, it's such an experience. If you love The Last of Us, definitely play it. If you're new to The Last of Us, which I don't know why you'd be listening to this, but if you've listened thus far, you should play it. This is the definitive version in my mind, and I can see why they did it. It's very good.
Yeah, I think that's it. You have to experience it yourself. Seeing it on like a YouTube or live stream isn't the same as interacting with it.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Well, listen, appreciate you coming on, Danielle. Is there anything you want to plug?
Thank you for having me.
Any projects you got coming up? Where can people find you? Where should they look for your stuff?
So you can find me over at levelstory.net or on Twitter at levelstory_. Provided that Twitter's still around, which, you know, probably will be, but you never know.
You never know.
Twitter's a bit up in the air. Current projects, just trying to revamp Level Story, kind of shifting away from being a magazine, so more of Level Story as being an entity to being myself. So kind of focusing more on video essays and just general essays and stuff. It's slow moving, but it's coming along. So have some projects in the works that are hopefully will come out by the end of the year. We'll see.
Cool.
But, yeah.
Sounds good. Definitely go check Danielle out. We've done a bunch of stuff together. We're always talking about The Last of Us, to be completely honest, among other things, but usually The Last of Us.
Yeah.
One day Danielle will eventually convince me to play Kingdom Hearts. Don't know when that will be.
I will.
Yeah, it seems inevitable. Just like, you know, mathematically, is a law of large numbers. It will happen eventually. Look, if you like this kind of thing, you can find the rest of what we do at zeroindent.com. I've got a few articles about The Last of Us there, or you can support us at patreon.com/zeroindent. By the time you hear this, my third novel should be just about out. You can find all of my books at maynardtreat.com. That's kind of it for now. We've got, I have another podcast which I just wrapped up, which is Give Up After 3, which is possibly the world's most in-depth analysis of BBC Sherlock, with a YouTuber friend of mine, Darth. It's a really good time. Definitely check that out. It's on all the places where you find podcasts. You can also find me at Black Swan Society, twitch.tv/Black Swan Society, every Thursday at 6 p.m. AEST. We stream The Advisory. We've got a few new fun projects coming up there as well. So something a bit more lighthearted, a bit less media crit related. You can find us over there. And then I also just completed a run of special James Bond specials on the Method to the Madness podcast with my friend Pat and his co-host Mitchie, where we watched all of the new Daniel Craig James Bond films and collectively kind of basically just talked about what makes them work and fantasized about how hot everybody is in those films. So you can go check that out. It's a really good time. That's all my pluggables. I'm always doing new stuff, but best place to kind of follow us is on YouTube or on zeroindent.com. That'll do it for this one. Thank you for watching or listening. If you enjoyed this, consider sending it to someone you think might enjoy it. Do all the things you guys do. Leave a comment, rate it, whatever it is. It helps more people find it. Otherwise, we appreciate your time, and we'll catch you in the next thing when we probably inevitably talk about this. Probably the TV show, to be completely honest.
Probably.
It's coming out soon, so we'll do something there, and we'll catch you guys then.